Good morning, everybody, to this first workshop session at the Science of Consciousness conference this year. As you all know, this is a hybrid format, so there will also be people around the world, about 600 registrations, I think, on Zoom, listening to us, and this has some consequences for the organization of the whole event. We have 4 speakers in the session. So we have 4 slots, each of 45 to 50 minutes. And these 50 minutes include the Q&A. So we will have Q&A after each talk separately. And we have something like 30-40 minutes break in the middle. Okay? This means we start now. In something like 30 minutes, I will be finished with my talk. Then we go over into Q&A. And when the Q&A is over, the next speaker will begin his talk. That will be Dean Rickles from Australia. He's not here, so he will give his talk on on Zoom. You will see him on the screens. And then the same format, same thing. 30 minutes talk, and after that, Q&A. Then we go into the break. After the break, the third speaker will be my friend and colleague Paavo Pylkkänen from Helsinki, Finland. I think many of you will know him. Same thing, 30 minutes talk and 20 minutes Q&A. And the final speaker will be Robert Prentner. Robert is in Munich, and he will also be with us on Zoom. 30 minutes talk, 20 minutes Q&A. And then we have lunch. The title of this workshop is Progress on Dual Aspect Thinking. The title has been chosen that way because in recent years, there has been increasing interest, first of all, in dual aspect kind of models for the mind-matter relationship. And not only increasing interest, but there was also some progress, conceptually, theoretically, and also empirically. And those of you who are expecting something from neuroscience, not much neuroscience is going on in our talks here. We have phenomenology-oriented talks. We have talks oriented toward the study of exceptional experiences, as we call them. I will go into that. And one essential feature in all these talks is that the notion of meaning plays an important role. Meaning as an essential part in the fabric of a reality that is neither mental nor physical, and then manifests itself in relations between the mental and the physical. So this is only a very brief outline, and you will see how that pans out in different ways in the talks to come. Okay, so here's my first slide. This is a brief introduction what dual aspect monism actually is and how it can be understood. So the first wave of dual aspect monism was actually a reaction to René Descartes' interactive dualism. And Descartes' dualism, of course, you all know this, avoids both physicalist and idealist leanings. And the philosophical pioneers of this kind of dual aspect monism are Spinoza, first of all, in his Ethics, 1677, 350 years ago. And then I've put the name of Schelling here. In his Freedom Essay of 1809, also he proposes something which is much closer to Spinoza's thinking than to the typical idealist thinking that Schelling is usually attributed to. Schelling is usually, when you look into the textbooks, he's pointed out as one of the German idealists, but I think that Schelling and also to some extent Hegel are much more dual aspect thinkers than they are idealists. And there's a lot of philosophical research going on these days about this kind of new understanding of Schelling and Hegel. Then I will briefly talk about neutral monism, which is a close relative to dual aspect monism. And the important names here are Ernst Mach, William James, and Bertrand Russell. And the main figures in this talk are versions of dual aspect monism that have been inspired by the rise of quantum mechanics, of quantum theory in the 20th century. And the protagonists of these ways of thinking are, number one, Wolfgang Pauli and Carl Gustav Jung, the psychologist. Then we have the second lineage is Arthur Eddington, followed by John Wheeler. And the third lineage is David Bohm and Basil Hiley. So the interesting point that is not well known broadly is that all these three approaches, these three lineages, focus extremely manifestly on the notion of meaning. Meaning not in the sense of information simply, but meaning in the sense of understanding, insight, and stuff like that. So this is the first outline. And yeah, so for these quantum inspired versions, if you're interested in those in more detail, then there's a new book by myself and Dean Rickles, the next speaker, which has just been coming out with Routledge. Now I want to delineate in a little bit more detail several kinds of relatives to dual aspect monism, so you can better see how, for instance, neutral monism differs from dual aspect monism and how both of these differ from panpsychism and cosmopsychism. In panpsychism and cosmopsychism, nature is both mental and physical. Both and is the key here at the same time, both and. Either in each part of nature, then it's panpsychism, roughly speaking, or nature as a whole, then it's cosmopsychism. And you can read more about that in Bill Seeger's compendium on panpsychism, which was published in 2020, also by Routledge, or Philip Goff has written about cosmopsychism. There are many others. Then neutral monism. In neutral monism, there are psychophysically neutral elements, where psychophysically neutral means they are neither mental nor physical. This is the key difference from both mental and physical, right? Both and is different from neither nor, obviously. So the neutral elements are composed in such a way that the configurations that you obtain are either mental or physical, depending on which configuration you choose. This proposal is in some sense reductive, because you're supposed to be able to reduce the mental and the physical to the psychophysically neutral elements which configure the mental and the physical. And of course, this approach is inspired by classical system theory because it's a mereological kind of construction where parts give rise to wholes. And again, the names here are Mach, James, and Russell. I will not go into the quote here. But then the third version, that's the version I will be talking about in the rest of the talk. That is the version of decompositional dual aspect monism, a psychophysically neutral whole, which is neither mental nor physical. Because then the question arises, what is it? And I will talk about that. This whole gets decomposed into the mental and the physical, and this scheme is of course not reductive, because you cannot reduce parts to wholes. What you can do is reduce wholes to parts, but that would be neutral monism. So this is the approach which is inspired by quantum holism, by quantum entanglement, and I will tell you in a while how this looks in more detail. Okay, here you see the protagonists. You see on the upper left, Wolfgang Pauli, lower left, Carl Gustav Jung, upper middle, Arthur Eddington, a very famous British physicist, middle, lower line middle, That's John Wheeler, John Archibald Wheeler. And the upper right is David Bohm. And the lower right is Basil Hiley. Basil Hiley is actually the only one of those 6 who are still with us and working on this approach. I don't know the other, maybe also working on it, but they are not with us anymore. At least not in the usual understanding. Yes, exactly. Okay, here's a scheme how you can understand this kind of decompositional dual aspect monism. So you have these 2 domains, the mental and the physical. And underlying those domains, you have the psychophysically neutral domain, a third domain, a tertium quid, so to speak, which also is part of reality in total. So we have, this is a specific feature in dual aspect thinking. You do not only have the mental and the physical and try to relate them in some way or another, but you have a tertium quid, which plays an essential role, a third part of reality, which is actually considered more fundamental than the mental and the physical. So in a way, the psychophysically neutral is the ontology of the picture, and the mental and the physical are ways in which the psychophysically neutral appears to us, physically or mentally. In the psychophysically neutral, you see here some notions which actually come out of the Pauli-Jung connection. The collective unconscious is something that is not part of our individual consciousness. First of all, it's unconscious, but then it's also collectively unconscious. So these are general ideas or pictures or structures or patterns that underlie our capacities of thinking, feeling, and so on. And in the same way, these patterns underlie our theories about the physical world. So the physical domain is a kind of world model, the mental domain is a kind of self model, and the way in which these 2 interact is in some way arranged by the psychophysically neutral. And when you really go deep down, then everything is actually undivided. So there's what you're left with is just one undivided base reality. And Jung has called this the unus mundus, the one world, just to make clear that this does not consist of parts like the mental and the physical, or something like that. So key features of this picture, I'll just give you a list of 5 or 6 key features. The unus mundus, the undivided one world, is conceived as one fundamental psychophysically neutral domain without distinctions such as mind, matter, subject, object, self, world, and whatever you want to think of. And the mental and the physical, mind and matter, so to speak, emerge as dual aspects, epistemic aspects, due to a kind of partitioning of the holistic neutral domain. But the fact that this neutral domain doesn't have mental and physical parts already, they have to manifest themselves, they are not part of it already, but this doesn't mean that the archetypal patterns in the psychophysically neutral cannot be distinguished. Of course, there's a whole hierarchy of these patterns, of these order elements that lie in the, if you want, between the unus mundus and the mental and the physical aspects. So we can make distinctions there, but these distinctions are not distinctions between the mental and the physical. And psychophysical correlations, so correlations between the mental and the physical, reflect the lost holism of archetypal patterns, because whenever you make a distinction between something that presents itself primarily as a whole, whenever you make these distinctions, then the lost holism appears in correlations between the parts. So whenever you break up something, then you get the parts, and of course then the parts are correlated somehow. That's a very general feature. And this is now one important point here. the psychophysical correlations are substantiated neither causally nor by chance. So they're, when you are a typical scientist, then you would say, whenever you see a correlation, then you want to ask, where does it come from? And the first reflex is you look for a causal relation. If something is causally related, of course, then you find it correlated. And so in all these approaches, the psychophysical correlations are not considered as being substantiated by causation. And they are also assumed to be not by chance, but rather they are associated or related to one another by meaning. So meaning in these approaches, as opposed to purely syntactic information, is posed as a basic relational ingredient in the fabric of reality. And this is a pretty radical move, but we will see where it leads to. Now, how does quantum theory come into the picture? Because all these approaches, as I said before, are quantum inspired. And the reason is that all the protagonists that we're talking about use quantum theory as a kind of pullback metaphor. What is a pullback metaphor? If a largely unknown situation is considered in structural analogy to a well-understood situation, and this is called a pullback metaphor. So if you consider particularly suitable features of quantum theory as a pullback metaphor for the mind-matter problem, that's what I'm going to show you in the next slides, then you hope you get a chance to understand the unknown situation better in terms of the analogy, right? And particularly important for decompositional dual aspect monism is to use quantum entanglement as a pullback metaphor for relations between the physical and the mental. That's the idea of the pullback metaphor. I think the notion pullback metaphor comes from an American mathematician at, I think it's Stanford, Keith Devlin, and he coined that notion maybe 20 years ago. Okay, so now we have, I'm on this slide, I'm discussing the first pullback option you can think of. And this pullback option refers to bipartite quantum entanglement. So this is a quantum entangled state, which you can decompose into two parts, bipartite. And you see this scheme here, you have, in the lower line, you have this symbolism here, which is psi ent, means psi entangled. That's the entangled state. And what it says here is that this entangled state cannot be written as a product state. So it's unequal psi1 product psi2. And this is the whole point of entanglement. An entangled state does not consist of parts. But of course, you can generate the parts by certain interactions with the system. And then you go into the upper line. You get psi1 and psi2 separately. So you separate these parts. And then, because you destroyed the wholeness of the entangled state by separating it into parts, you get correlations. And these correlations already in quantum mechanics are not causal. So they, in some sense, violate the reflex of the scientist to look for causation whenever you see correlation. And these correlations can be measured. They have been, there have been hundreds of experiments by now in which these correlations are confirmed without any reasonable doubt. Now, how can this be a pullback metaphor? You see this picture here, this scheme, that's a scheme which tries to illustrate how the scheme of bipartite quantum entanglement can be related to mind-matter correlations. And you see at the bottom, you see psychophysically neutral states. The pullback metaphor for those would be the entangled quantum state. And in the upper line, you see the mental and the physical related by acausal correlations. So the psychophysically neutral would be the analogy to the entangled state. And the mental and the physical would be the analogy to psi1 and psi2, the decomposed quantum states. Again, we have a-causal correlations between the mental and the physical. We see these correlations all the time. For instance, neural correlates of consciousness would be something like correlations of this type, or psychosomatic relations. When you are in stress, then your blood pressure rises. So this is nothing very special. We all know it. The only point is that we don't understand it, right? We don't have a really kind of comprehensive model to understand these relations. So this is the pullback option number 1, which already explains the idea. Now, I will show you something that is a little more complicated, pullback option 2. And how can you make something more complicated when you start with bipartite, tripartite? So now you don't have only 2 parts which you generate out of the whole. You now have a tripartite system with, now I don't go into the physical anymore, I just show you the picture for the mind-matter relation. And in a tripartite system like this one, you make essential use of the idea that you don't have only the mental and the physical to relate, but you also have a psychophysically neutral PPN here, which plays an essential role in the whole understanding of the situation. Now we have the M and P, the mental and the physical, related by sigma 1, the correlation sigma 1. We have the mental and the psychophysically neutral, for instance, the collective unconscious, related by sigma 2 correlations. And you have the physical and the psychophysically neutral related by sigma 3 correlations. So now here is the pullback idea. In a tripartite situation, we have 2 classes of decomposition, not only one, as in the bipartite case. Now we have 2 decomposition classes. The first one is called the GHZ class. These are the initials of Greenberger, Horn, and Zeilinger, 3 people working in this area very heavily. And if you decompose a tripartite system in a GHZ kind of way, then you get the mental and the physical and the psychophysically neutral all separated from one another at once. So there's no entanglement left. The other decomposition class is the W state, the W class. And if you decompose, now in the W situation, if you decompose, if you isolate, so to speak, one of the 3 poles of the tripartite system, then this gets decomposed, but the other 2 remain entangled. This is all well known in physics, of course, but it's also an interesting metaphor for the mind-matter situation, because you can now, in the W situation, you can talk about a separation of the physical, while the psychophysical neutral and the mental remain entangled. You can talk about a separation of the mental, while the other 2 remain entangled. And you can talk about the psychophysically neutral as separated, while the mental and the physical remain entangled. And now these correlations that I'm talking about when I talk about entanglement are triple correlations in the composite system M and P and PPN. So these are tripartite correlations where everything is entangled. Then these tripartite correlations can be disentangled into a surface structure and a deep structure. And that's an important point in our understanding of these correlations as substantiated by some kind of meaning. And what we have been doing in the book with Dean Rickles, we relate the surface structure to intentionality, a term that is very often used in the philosophy of mind. That's a kind of reference relation between the mental and the physical. And this is how, this is the Brentano-Metzinger line of thinking. But in addition to that, we have a deep structure that is only possible because we have the psychophysically neutral domain in addition to the mental and the physical. And this deep structure helps us to understand another kind of meaning, which is symbolic sense. And that's something that goes back to an old paper by Gottlob Johann Frege, a German philosopher, end of the 19th century. And recently, Marcus Gabriel, a philosopher at the University of Bonn, has made very interesting use of this kind of sense or meaning as sense in his work. So what I want to say here, we have a surface structure, which is simply intentionality. But in addition, due to the tripartite nature of the system, we also have a deep structure of meaning. Now, let me just make a few comments about the deep structure. These are the correlations that we have denoted as sigma 2 and sigma 3. So sigma 2 would be the correlation between the psychophysically neutral and the mental. So PPN, psychophysically neutral, as archetypal patterns. This is something that in C.G. Jung's work is called the first stage conjunctio. That's the unification of the contact between the conscious mental attitude of an individual with its collective unconscious. And the relation that is actually considered as sigma 2 in our picture, that would be something that Jung calls the transcendent function. So that's a function which serves the means to bring an individual into contact with his or her unconscious functioning. But now we also have sigma 3. That's the correlation between PPN and the physical world. And if you consider something, if you're looking for something psychophysically neutral that plays a role for physics, then one of the first candidates you hit is, of course, mathematical structures. I have to add in brackets, in a Platonic understanding, because in a Platonic understanding, mathematical structures are neither mental nor physical. They are an extra domain. And when you listen to Roger Penrose's talks, he addresses essentially mathematical structures in this understanding. Now, if you use these correlations sigma 3, then you get a very interesting and a very simple answer to Eugene Wigner's question in a famous article that he published in the 1960s, I think. In the 1960s, Wigner published a paper with the title, "The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences." And he ends this paper with the question that, this is an undeserved point in the history of science and a completely unexplained point. Why is mathematics so effective to describe what we are looking for in the natural sciences? And in this picture, decomposition and dual aspect monism with sigma 3, you get a natural answer, because mathematical structures are related not only to the mental, but also to the physical in a strict sense. So these are some indications about the deep correlations. Now, some more about the surface correlations. And the surface correlations are those between sigma 1, are those between the mental and the physical. They have been studied a lot. I said already, neural correlates of consciousness would be an example, but we have more drastic examples too. Because we have to distinguish between surface correlations that are persistent. And for instance, when you study those, you can use criteria like reproducibility and other methodological cornerstones of science. But then you also have occasional induced psychophysical correlations, and these are not necessarily reproducible. So this is what we in the literature have called exceptional or extraordinary experiences. The persistent ones are robustly reproducible, but the induced correlations are evasive. And when you try to reproduce them, it typically doesn't work. Because structural correlations are stable, they provide a baseline above and below which we can arrange the non-structural, the induced correlations. So they have deviations from that baseline, and the deviations can be positive and negative. In the positive case, we talk about excess correlations, so correlations that are more than in the baseline case. And the other case would be deficit correlations. That's the case where certain correlations between the mental and the physical seem to get lost, experiences of dissociation. So experiences of coincidence, typical cases are what Jung studied a lot in terms of his synchronicities. And experiences of dissociation, Jung didn't focus so much on, but they're also there. For instance, we know out-of-body experiences. Out-of-body experiences, the correlation between the sense of mindness, which is a mental state, and the bodily state are disrupted, right? Or sleep paralysis or other interesting phenomena. These are all cases of deficit correlations. And both of these correlations, deficit and excess, are experienced as meaningful because they deviate from the baseline of ordinary correlations, for instance, between the self model and the world model. And if the deviation is large, then this is the situation in which Jung would talk about numinous experiences. Some people would also call these religious kinds of experiences. And in the ordinary case of baseline correlations, there is, of course, no deviation at all, and therefore, there is not much meaning to be ascribed to those. I mean, a neural correlate of a conscious state, you wouldn't attribute a lot of meaning to when you experience it. It's just there. Okay. So here's a kind of schematic representation of 4 classes of a taxonomy into 4 classes of phenomena that follow from decompositional dual aspect monism. We have the coincidence and the dissociation phenomena, and we also have internal phenomena, which are deviations within the self model of a subject. And we have external phenomena, which are deviations within the world model of the subject. The coincidence and dissociation phenomena are the more interesting cases because they are relational between the self model and the world model, right? Now I want to go into, and that will be probably my last point in this presentation. I want to go into some empirical studies which try to test whether the taxonomy that I just showed you really comes up in the real world. And in order to study that, we had a collaboration with people from the Institute for Frontier Areas of Psychology at Freiburg. And in this institute, they have a counseling and information department, which offers advice to people who experience exceptional experiences and don't understand them. Typically, these people have been trying to understand their experiences in psychiatric clinics, with psychoanalysts, with psychotherapists, but they remain undiagnosed because what they experience doesn't fit the DSM or the ICD or whatever these catalogs are called. I also want to refer you to work by Tanja Luhrmann at Stanford, who also has a taxonomy, a bipartite taxonomy, rather the fourfold that we have. But Tanya's classification maps actually the distinction between external and external phenomena in our classification. She doesn't talk so much about coincidence and dissociation states. And Taves is also an interesting researcher in this area. She's at the University of California at Santa Barbara. And she also focuses very much on the experience of meaning in these exceptional experiences. Now, you can systematically investigate these reports on exceptional experiences And as I mentioned, there is a huge empirical body of such reports that has been collected in Freiburg. And we can investigate the phenomenology of these experiences with certain statistical tools. And what we find is that all the analyses that we did really fits the taxonomy that follows from the dual aspect model. I will show you here in this graph. I want to show you how different populations of people who report these exceptional experiences are distinguished from one another. You see again, on the vertical axis, you see the distinction between coincidence and dissociation phenomena. On the horizontal axis, you see the distinction between internal left and external phenomena on the right-hand side. And then you see six figures in this arrangement here, which refer to 6 different subpopulations of individuals that report these experiences. And I should also explain to you what these concentric circles mean. The circles mean frequencies of the experiences in the particular populations. So the outermost circle means number 2, the center is 0. 0 means they experience exceptional experiences never. 1 means sometimes. 2 means often. 3 would mean always. And there's another, well, not always, but something between always and often. And 4 would be the maximum number that we ask in the questionnaires. Of course, that's not reached as a mean value in all these populations. So interesting is that the outermost population in these circles, that's the population of people who had near-death experiences before in their life, and MED means people who have a lot of meditative practice. So these experience all these phenomena most frequently. And the more you go into the center of the circles, you see the next one would be the IGPP group. That's the Freiburg group, people looking for advice or help. Then you have the next one is a sample of general population in I think this is at the University of West Georgia, which has been researched there. So that's a USA sample. Then going further in is a sample of students at the German University of Gießen. And the innermost structure there is a study which has been very comprehensive with general population in Switzerland, a representative study, which was very demanding, with about 1,500 subjects. So you see what you expect. The more general the population gets, the less frequent are the phenomena. But what you also see is the pattern is the same for all populations, right? And that's something which is also very interesting, because this seems to tell us something, and we don't understand yet what it is. We see an asymmetry between coincidence and dissociation phenomena. This can be understood or at least plausibly understood in some way, due to the fact that human beings are meaning seekers. So whenever something enhances the correlations, that goes toward more meaning that you find in the phenomena, while dissociation experiences are just the opposite. I think this is the summary, right? Dual aspect monism considers the mental and the physical as dual aspects of one underlying psychophysically neutral domain. Meaning plays an essential role in the fabric of reality as sense. This is number 1. In the deep structure that involves the psychophysically neutral. And number 2, as reference, the intentionality, in the surface structure relating just M and P, the mental and the physical. We have two types of these surface correlations. The persistent ones, which form a baseline from which we can study the deviations. And then we can come up with a systematic taxonomy, psychophysical correlations, surface correlations. And this taxonomy is empirically supported by phenomenological studies of exceptional experiences. So thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of the first part of the session. And of course, I know that there are many open questions, and I hope that you will actively contribute now in the Q&A session. We have agreed, Paavo and I have agreed, that for the Q&A, we will prefer people who ask questions here in the audience, in person. And of course, then once in a while, Paavo will check on the Zoom chat whether there are questions also from remote participants. So thank you very much again for your attention. And the talk is open for questions, discussion.
Yes.
Yes, can you, can you use the microphone over here? I think the usual style here at Tucson is that you can line up
form a
behind the
queue
microphones.
behind it.
Oh, thank you. Very informative. I'm with the IANS, International Association for Near-Death Studies, and NDEs are predominant motif. I've had a lot of contact personally with experiencers, and there seems to be more prevalence to what I'm going to call a unity consciousness, or blending with source, all that is. Do you have different scales or gradations of the depth that your experiencers on your surveys describe?
Yeah. Yes, we also, I mean, we ask for the frequency of the experiences that I showed you. We also ask for the intensity of the experiences. Because when the intensity increases, then what we expect is a larger deviation from the baseline. Right, and that's what happens. But you know, this is a huge research project. We don't know more details about this right now. You know, resources are always limited, so we're working that way, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, a division I thought was really well described as an individual having had one of these experiences, as they've adapted, and we describe adjusting to their experiences over time so that they kind of have a balance in life between being here and there. This individual described it as like having 1 foot here and 1 foot everywhere.
Everywhere. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation. It's very illuminating. I have a philosophical question about this distinction between intentionality as reference and then the Fregean sense.
Yes.
And that's, to me at least, seems a little bit confused, because what Brentano meant by intentionality is not reference, like that I'm the reference towards a physical object, but it can be sense in the meaning, in the sense of the mind has the mental content is a proposition, let's say a mathematical proposition, 2 + 2 = 4. That's already intentionality. And how is that then different from sense? So I think that, yeah.
Okay.
You get it?
Yeah, I think I get the framework of the question. We were working backward from Metzinger's analysis of Brentano to Brentano himself, right? And Metzinger's analysis, so one difference between Metzinger's understanding and Brentano is, you're right, Brentano also addresses intentional content of a mental representation in terms of the reference to something that is also a mental representation. That's possible. Brentano was, but Brentano was focusing a lot on the relation between something out there. And Metzinger made the point that that intentionality is not necessarily something out there. That's Metzinger's interpretation. But the something out there is also couched into a model. So that's why Metzinger never talks about the world out there. He always talks about world models, and the elements of world models are the targets of the intentional content of a mental representation. So in that sense, it fits, because the world model can also be considered as part of your own, representational apparatus, let me say. So that's the intentionality and reference part. Now, sense, when you know this better than I, there's this famous paper by Frege, Sense and Reference, of 1890 something. And that paper was published in German at that time. And the German title is again confusing, because the German title is not über Sinn und Referenz, it is über Sinn und Bedeutung. We are using Bedeutung as the cover term, the umbrella term, to distinguish sense and reference. And I don't know who it was, but the English translation of Frege's paper then was sense and reference. And somehow the understanding of the person who translated it was actually, about the notion of sense, was actually trying to pull away from any metaphysical dimension of sense into a philosophy of language discourse. That's why Frege's paper now in present, a philosophy of language, is rated very highly, while the metaphysical ideas that Frege put in his paper in the German original version got widely lost. And this is the metaphysical. What we try to address with sense is the metaphysical dimension. And that's why we use the notion of sense for the correlations between the psychophysically neutral, that's the metaphysical part of our picture, between that and the more epistemic parts of the mental and the physical. I don't know whether that helps a little, but of course we can talk about that in more detail. Yes.
Hello, I'm Richard Gill. Thank you for the interesting talk. I want to ask you one or two things about quantum entanglement, which you mentioned early on. This is something which really does exist and has been studied in the physical world.
Exactly.
But the entangled states are all very, very delicate.
Yes.
It's very difficult to keep them alive, as it were, as the people
That's
who
true.
try to make
Yes.
quantum computers discover. Part of your argument was by analogy with quantum entanglement, but what I wanted to ask you is, do you really think that entangled states actually play a role in the mind and in mental states? And if they do, nobody seems to have seen them, but I mean, that might be, due to ignorance, as it were. So what I want to know is, do you believe they're an active part of mental processes, or if they don't exist in the mind, it then has to become classical?
Okay, so your question has several aspects. One aspect might be the question, does quantum entanglement as it is used in physics play a role in the brain? This is a research project which some people here at the Tucson conference have pushed forward a lot. Like this is orchestrated objective reduction, this kind of project. This is not at all what I address.
Okay.
A second nuance in your question could be, is the mathematical formalism that we use in physics to describe entanglement also capable of describing certain mental structures which may structurally and analogously look like entanglement but have nothing to do with physical entanglement? That's also a research program which is going on at several places around the globe. That's called quantum cognition now. And a third nuance of your question could be, and that's the one I was talking about.
Yeah.
Does the mathematical structure that we can use to describe quantum entanglement in the physical world and quantum cognition entanglement-like structures in the mental, this mathematical structure, can that also be used as a, I call it a pullback metaphor, to understand a much bigger problem, namely the problem of how the mental and the physical are related to one another. That's the nuance that I was talking about here. But the other areas are also active research programs, let me say.
Yeah, okay, thanks for the
You're
clarification.
welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah. We should go to the next one at some point.
Greetings, Harold.
So that should be
Thank
the
you
last
for your
question.
talk.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
I start by saying I have not, to my knowledge, ever had a out-of-body foundational experience. So I'm talking as sort of a naive person on this respect. First of all, I'm aware that I'm in a value system, and therefore that our language too complicates the question of what's really out there in this moment of out-of-body experience or what transcendent experience, and is the psychophysical neutral? Do we call it spiritual, or is that getting into a different era? And if we keep it at psychophysical neutral, are we reflecting words that are comfortable in our particular era, but maybe not appropriate at a different era? So my question is, if I have an extraordinary experience, am I right to claim it as some people have? This is ineffable, and this is really beyond our limited scope, or is it simply a reflection of semi-delusional activity going on in my brain that is making me, is it disruptive? I mean, okay, I might say it's an aha experience. Some of these reports involve people who have brain distortions, and they pay a terrible price for having this momentary experience. But the question is, how do we define, is it really getting to an answer, some of these experiences, or is it just a subjective question?
Okay.
Gets nowhere.
Yeah, okay. So I mentioned Spinoza as the first, maybe let's say, originator of dual aspect thinking in this. I mean, Spinoza didn't have quantum mechanics, of course. Don't misunderstand me, but he had this grand vision of a psychophysically neutral, which he never called that way. He called it the divine.
The
So
divine.
that would be the spiritual dimension, which you were addressing, right?
That would be the what?
The spiritual.
Oh, yeah, the
dimension.
divine. Yeah.
Or the religious, some people would say the religious dimension.
Right.
Now, the position of mathematical Platonism also targets the psychophysically neutral, because for the mathematical Platonist, there's a world out there which is neither mental nor physical. But of course, the good mathematician or the best mathematicians are somehow able to make contact with that world, and then they see something.
I see.
You know, they have an intuition or a vision or kind of insight, and then they literally would say, "Now I see it." Of course, not with these eyes, right? So these would be two possible ways to make more sense of the psychophysically neutral. I use the notion of psychophysically neutral because it is the most, it deflates the issue. Because, you know, you can go into math, you can go into religion, and this is everybody can make his own choice.
Right.
I just have a kind of cover notion which is capable of fitting all these things. Now, the other part of your question was, when I have such an experience, is it blissful and enriching, or is it burdening, essentially? In both cases, we know. It's not the case that all of these experiences are just liberating yourself into a nirvana state. It can also happen. The opposite can also happen. that after the experience, you feel completely miserable and need more help than you ever needed before.
Yeah.
So this is both possible. I don't know on which factors this depends. This is maybe something people with experience in psychotherapy and psychiatry might be knowing more about, but I have to leave it open right now.
Yeah. I would just add that I think most of us have all had a thought about somebody, and then suddenly that person happens to be walking by. So I think that we can all share to a certain extent.
Yeah, that's a very mild synchronicity experience.
Okay, thanks.
Maybe one
more
more,
question
and
here
then
is
we
here.
go to the next talk, right?
Thank you. Thank you for your talk.
Yes.
I appreciate so much your attempt to bring together dual aspect thinking and a kind of ontological monism. But my doubt is about the use of the quantum theories, in particular the idea that we can substitute the classical notion of causation, with a new type of causation, maybe influenced by statistical and so on issues. Okay. I appreciate the landscape, but I don't understand why this substitution of the notion of causality is a good argument to bring together monism from an ontological point of view and dual aspect thinking from epistemological point of view.
Okay. So I would say already in the sciences, we have different domains which we can talk about.
Yeah.
Right? We have physics, we have biology, we have psychology.
Right.
Within physics, we have different subdomains like thermodynamics, electrodynamics, mechanics, and so on and so on. Between all these domains, we have correlations.
Yeah.
That's just what makes science a kind of endeavor targeting a unified description of the world, right? That's what the correlations do.
Yeah.
But none of these correlations between domains, interdomain correlations, none of them is causal, already there. Now, talking about relations between the physical and the mental, this is even more so, because when you want to have a causal relation between the physical and the mental, you would have to have interactions, forces, and this is hard to conceive because in the mental, for instance, we don't have intuition or we don't have space, we don't have location. So all the physical interactions that we know play out in a space in which objects are situated and the interactions are between the objects. And we know these fundamental forces. These fundamental forces are complete in themselves. That's what many philosophers call the causal closure of the physical, right? And we don't want to change physics with our approach. We want to leave physics as it is. And the only way to do that is that we introduce a kind of substantiation for the correlations between the physical and the mental that does not affect the physical.
Yeah.
This is the point, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the physicist can lean back and be happy with it because he doesn't change anything. He doesn't need to change anything. And if he's not interested in the mental and the mind-matter problem, he can go home and be happy.
Okay, I
But
see.
if you're interested in this, then the substantiation of correlations by meaning opens up a whole new universe of understanding correlations.
Yeah,
I think this is a fantastic thing.
yeah.
But you don't need to buy it, because if you are a physicist, you can lean back.
Okay. I'm not completely convinced, but I see the point.
Yes, I know. That's good. Now, let's put on. Chris, can you put on Dean Rickles now? So Dean will give the next talk, and he will introduce the title and the subject of his talk himself. It should be visible on the screens real quick. There he is.
Hi.
Good morning.
Can you hear me? Is the sound okay?
Sound is okay, seems to be okay, I think. Yes.
Okay, good. So I will just share screen. Here we go. Okay, now so you can now see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Visible. Yeah, that's great. So they are.
Okay, all right. So thanks, Harald, for organizing this session. I was not expecting a 2:30 a.m. session. So I'm a little bit tired over here in Australia. We'll see how we go. Dual aspect monism is often presented primarily as a solution to the mind-body problem, where we have this ontological democracy between mind and matter, and neither is reducible to the other. And we end up with both ultimately appearing as a kind of second-class citizen emerging from some more primary realm. And as Harald mentioned, it's related to neutral monism in this sense. And as he also pointed out, there's more than one path to neutral monism. We can either have decomposition or composition. And as the last question that was asked there noted, what we have, in fact, with dual aspect monism is a global ontology that has as a kind of side effect a solution to the mind-body problem. So the fundamental stuff in dual aspect monism belongs to a deeper realm that's neither material nor mental, neither subject nor object. And this means that the creation of things, the multiplicity that we see, mind, matter, and even the entirety of the phenomenal or empirical world, all emerge from this deeper domain, which has many names. So Harald called it the psychophysically neutral realm. He also mentioned the unus mundus, could call it the absolute or the unconditioned, or it has a whole bunch of names going back into sort of ancient philosophy. And it seems to be that this strange substance, whatever it is that which reveals itself in multiplicity. So contra Heraclitus's claim that nature loves to hide, it seems that sort of ultimate nature loves to manifest itself through a kind of symmetry breaking, in this case, from an extreme state of symmetry in which there's a unity of opposites. Now, the basic idea of this talk, and it's a working progress, because I knew Harald was going to speak about some of the things from our book. So this is basically, I'm trying to find some case study that really demands a dual aspect approach. And I think that if we look at music, and in particular meter in music, we could possibly mention tonality as well, but particularly meter is a perfect case study in this sense for pointing to something beyond the subject-object distinction or merging them somehow. It's somehow bound up with the creation of the subject-matter conjunctions that we find from this deeper neutral realm. And so it's connected, as Harald mentioned, with meaning as well. So we find that meter sits very uncomfortably between subject and object, doesn't really belong to either fully. So I can answer straight away the question that's posed in the title of my talk, whether it's a subject, object, neither or both, and that's that it's neither subject nor object, but it's not quite either, both either in any simple sense. There's also something participatory about meter as well, as I'll show. And so I'm not the first to mention that there's something elemental in music, of course, something absolute. Schopenhauer elevated music to this supreme position in the arts, which he saw as occupying a hierarchy with music at the top, enabling access to divine wisdom, the will, precisely because it doesn't represent anything in the manifest world, anything phenomenal. Likewise, the anthroposophists of the early 1900s, such as Steiner and so on, also placed a great weight on music as a way of accessing the higher worlds and those kinds of ideas. So as a musician, I can't help but agree with this idea. It seems to be beyond conceptual understanding, and I'd say it's capable of generating states that are not easily locatable in space and time, which is characteristic of this psychophysically neutral realm involved in dual aspect monism, as Harald mentioned. So, a nice way of introducing the themes in this talk is through this quote from Victor Zurkekandel in this book, Sound and Symbol. So he says, do we hear rhythm or do we hear the meter too? The conductor has to beat the meter, the time, in order to keep his men together. Is the time that he beats also part of the direct experience of hearing music? Now, sometimes the meter matches, the music matches the meter by carving out equal time units in the music itself, especially in dance music, where we have this kind of constant thud. But the meter is not always marked out like this in the music, and often we can find a beat that is applied to pure silence, which is often how music achieves its effects. We will also hear some pulses, some musical pulses as more important as beats than others, even though they're completely perceptually identical in terms of the incoming data stream. And when you put it like this, since meter is is about musical time, we know that time can't be part of the direct experience. We don't ever observe time. We only ever observe events in time. But meter seems to be part of how we observe events situated in time. It's a kind of ordering structure, a kind of archetypal ordering structure. So another nice quote to get into some of the themes of this talk is this from Guarino Mazzola, who has a nice book on the deep mathematics of music, the topos of music. And he asks, okay, so given that music theory and music itself is the creation of human beings, what does reality mean in such a context? And we often find that there's this tension in music theory over what the object of study is, whether it's subjective or objective. I mentioned we can also apply this to tonality, and in music theory circles, it's usually applied to tonality and not meter, but I think meter goes a little bit deeper even than tonality. So we always find that there's this ineliminable reflexivity in music theory to do with the fact that humans observe the music, but the music is as it is because of human capacities for thinking. So what we're doing when we're doing music theory is essentially analyzing our own footprint, to use a Eddingtonian metaphor. So if not resolving these kinds of tensions in music, it certainly, dual aspect monism certainly offers a tertium quid between these two broad positions, whether meter is in the mind or whether meter is in the world. And I think it fits very well certain aspects coming out of what are these entrainment approaches, in which meter involves linking internal clocks, very non-conceptual structures in the body, linking these with an external environment in a kind of feedback loop. Okay. And I'll also point out that I think an answer to this question of what reality means in such a context has to include the observer participator. Now, so as often happens then when discussing the ontological status of some phenomenological item, time is an obvious example. We always find this split of objects, so meter is no exception here. We always end up with a pair of positions, which is the mind as and the world as, right? Some things in the mind, some phenomenon X is in the mind versus some phenomenon X is in the head. So just to explain what I mean by meter. Meter is basically concerned with the beats, the thing you feel, and rhythm is concerned with the pulses which you hear. So a pulse is literally heard and a beat is somehow intuited in a slightly different way. So there's some similarities with interpretations of quantum theory here. So the objectivist would consider music as existing out there apart from the listener with its own properties and so on. And so would treat our listening experiences as efforts to come to know or find out the properties of that external object. By contrast, a subjectivist would argue that musical structures are the product of the interaction between an external object and our cognitive faculties, very similar to the kind of debates we see Bohr and Einstein engaging in over whether, for example, whether an electron has its properties regardless of whether we're setting up an experiment to observe it. Okay. So there's a general lesson in all of this, I think, which is that we usually treat the world's foundation as grounded in appearances, in the experienced or manifest world. Well, that seems like a mistake, a fundamental kind of mistake. We never really find an explanation of appearances within appearances. So we're not going to get any elimination of the strangeness that Hegel mentions here. So he says the aim of knowledge is to divest the objective world that stands opposed to us of its strangeness, and as the phrase is, to find ourselves at home in it, which means no more than to trace the objective world back to our innermost self, where he means something a little bit different from just our subjective self. So historically, the idea that there are laws of music akin to the laws of nature, just like physics, is commonplace. So Huygens here, for example, is a key defender of this kind of view. So he believed that there were laws of music, and he pointed to their objective universal nature. So in other words, he did not think they were a mental phenomenon. So he says the laws of music are unchangeably fixed by nature, hence they should hold not only for the entire Earth, but for inhabitants of other planets as well. So there are problems with the kinds of law that he mentions in the work that this quote comes from. So he's talking about preservation of consonants and those ideas, but there are all sorts of systems of music, Oriental, Indian, Indonesian musics, and so on, that don't share this notion where you get 5-tone and 7-tone scales and so on. So such features are going to be hard to uphold as universal laws anyway. If you're going to go down this path, you'd need to seek more invariant kinds of laws. And here, octave equivalence is a good example. So harmonically speaking, if you play notes an octave apart, it makes no difference. So to the observer, it makes no real difference. So the trick it would be to find elements of musical structure, changes of which would be undetectable, much like these symmetries that you get in, for example, associated with Galilean relativity, where spatial translations, rotations, and so on are undetectable in physics. That notion of undetectable, however, brings in an observer in this case, because we're talking about a musical experience that's undetectable. So I won't dwell on this point. There's a great book by Dmitry Tymochko at Princeton called The Geometry of Music, where he finds a whole class of these kinds of invariants, and they take quite a surprising form relating to the orbifolds that you can find in superstring theory. So the archetypal objectivist about music is really Jean-Philippe Rameau, who was a composer as well as writing tracts on musicology. As he puts it, music is just a physico-mathematical science with sound as its object, and the ratios found between different sounds constitute its mathematical object, with sound as its physical object. This is something akin to the Pythagorean view that music is the harmony of spheres or something like that. Again, it's going to be a thing that's independent of humans. So this is Rameau's answer to what musical reality is. Still leaves us with an ambiguity over what the raw materials of music analysis are, because sounds, if we're going to assume that they are pitches and tones and so on, can also be viewed in a subjective or an objective way. Now, at the opposite end of the spectrum, we end up with this view of Fred Lerdahl and Ray Yakendorf, who are linguists by training. So they present, again, what is supposed to be a universal theory of tonal music, but it entails, rather than some physical laws, it entails that theories of music should sit within cognitive science. So they say that musical structures are mental products imposed on or inferred from the physical signal, and that a piece of music is a mentally constructed entity. And they come up with a whole bunch of principles of cognition based on things like Husserlian principles and all sorts of things to do with time perception. I won't go into it. So let's just get a better handle on what we mean by by meter here. So we can think of it most easily as imagining taking the linear structure of time that you would get in a piece of music and wrapping it into a circle. And then this would give you a cycle. In this case, I've drawn an 8 cycle. And then the beats are organized in these meters corresponding to subharmonics. So here we would have a simple quadruple meter. We could imagine a 9 cycle, which would be a triple meter, something like this, or we could have a more complex meter, which would be something like Brubeck's Blue Rondo. So in this case, we would have 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 3. Now, the theory of Lerdahl and Jakendorf is that we have a raw event stream that comes in. There's then an extraction of pulses, and then the meter is inducted onto that that pulse stream. So for the case of the quadruple time, it would look something like this. Now, where we've basically got a hierarchy of accents on these pulses, which themselves don't necessarily have those particular accents in the incoming stream. The problem is there's metrical underdetermination by the sound that's coming in, and this is indicated by experimental results, which I'll mention if I have some time. There is a problem that those accounts don't take into consideration, which is that music is not just about the sort of taking it in, the absorption, as Minsky puts it here, but it's also about the creation. So here I'll describe how absorption and creation go hand in hand. The creation aspect in this case is obviously informed by the absorption aspect, by the very nature of music. Temperley, who's a music theorist, puts it well here. So he says, why would the great composers have bothered to create such elaborate mental structures if they thought that these structures would never be shared by listeners? One way of making sense of this shared structure is precisely through musical meter. So for example, how much can you hold together in a unified bundle of conscious awareness? Okay, in other words, the specious present. And it turns out to be something like 100 milliseconds to a few seconds. The metric measure, the subharmonics of the beat, have to be within the limits of this present moment so that it doesn't get bundled into memory rather than in your phenomenal awareness, right? So it's not something that happened, rather it's something that is happening. So the cycles in the meter have to be compressed within the unit, especially if you want to dance to it or tap your foot to it. So this is called the perception of tactus, and it's the level of the beats that get conducted and at which we naturally coordinate our body movements. And there's a threshold beyond which we can't do that. So, I mean, given this, music meter might not even be fundamentally musical in origin. So sort of providing instead a good way of capturing the changing aspects of our environment as patterns of temporal invariance. So Mary Rees Jones has actually written some good things on the evolutionary idea of something like meter providing a background structure for anticipating events in your environment. And you can even relate this maybe to the law of energy minimization and finding patterns in your environment so you can safely ignore them. Similarly, in a very nice book by Justin London, he says the various capacities and thresholds that have been studied and quantified in the psychological laboratory are common sense aspects of everyday musical practice, and they are intuitively known to the composers when they write their music and to performers in their choices of tempo. And crucial to these intuitions are, of course, knowledge of the thresholds of awareness of these themes and structures that are going into making music. So the creation and the absorption are seen to be thoroughly entangled, so that a simple mind or world story is not going to be quite good enough. There's also the aspect that music, as David Lewin says, is something you do and not just something you perceive or understand. So he thinks that a theory of music can't be developed fully from a theory of musical perception. You need something that merges the subject and the object. I agree, and I think dual aspect monism is a good way of making sense of this. Now, obviously, this idea that there's something deep about music goes a long way back. I mentioned Schopenhauer already, and it seems to have to do with the fact that it is preconceptual. So as Wagner puts it here, the essence of higher instrumental music or absolute music consists in its uttering in tones a thing unspeakable in words. Now, for Wagner, this was a problem, and he thought that meant that music was too abstract and became detached from the earth and immaterial, which is precisely sort of what people like Schopenhauer thought was its virtue. You can also imagine something like John Dewey's claim that painting and music wouldn't exist if everything could be represented by language. So these are obviously things that transcend external description, says he, and that's the point of this talk. As Schopenhauer puts it here, the reason doesn't understand music. And of course, in his system, there's no object without subject, because everything objective is already conditioned as such in manifold ways by the knowing subject with the forms of its knowing, and it presupposes these forms. Now, the idea that the world of experience doesn't come with sort of essences attached is closely aligned with existentialist thought, and I particularly like this way of defining existentialism due to Irvin Yalom, who's a psychotherapist, but he was heavily influenced by Spinoza and Schopenhauer and by dual aspect approaches, it seems. So he says that the existentialist position challenges the traditional Cartesian view of a world full of objects and of subjects who perceive those objects. The existentialist position cuts below this subject-object cleavage and regards the person not as a subject who can, under the proper circumstances, perceive external reality, but as a consciousness who participates in the construction of reality. And I have this picture from John Wheeler, who Harald mentioned there, to sort of make this point a bit more clearly. So going back to our the two views, we have here the passive recipients of an objective signal, which would be the objective meter view. And this is going to be something similar to Einstein's view of quantum mechanics, that there's a world out there and it really has those properties and it doesn't care whether we observe it or not. And then we have the idea that we're somehow projecting on to an incoming signal, so that meter is purely subjective, so that the feature is not part of the objective world. And then we have what I think is the correct view, which is that there's a participatory thing going on here where we join with the world to co-create the music. So there's neither subjective nor objective meter independently of one another. Rather, there's a state of something like pure possibility at one stage before we co-create the meter and the music emerges. So I think the meter is a vital part of this creative project. It's something very, very deep in the music. It almost appears like a transcendental category in Kant's sense, which is sort of the thing that's required to have a musical experience. So this puts us in mind of the notion of participation mystique, which Jung defines like this. It denotes a peculiar kind of psychological connection with objects and consists in the fact that the subject cannot clearly distinguish himself from the object, but is bound to it by a direct relationship, which amounts to a partial identity. And this results from an a priori oneness of subject and object. I think in the case of meter, we have an extremely close bond between the object, the thing perceived, the music as having certain accents, and the music itself. So this kind of thinking is familiar from quantum mechanics, of course. Harald mentioned some of these themes already. This is a particularly nice quote from Bohm that links it to the quantum mechanical aspects and also links it to creation in art as well. So he says that it seems that a possible valid direction for the artist to explore is the problem of the unity of inner and outer, of subject and object. In physics, this has become an important problem because Thus, because of the indivisible quantal nature of all process, an observation is impossible in which the observer does not merge and blend with the object observed and participate in its very being. On the large scale, apparatus is usually too insensitive to reveal this fact, so it doesn't show up. But with very sensitive apparatus, it does show up. Nevertheless, our usual idea of separating the subject and object prevents us from understanding the indivisible character of all reality. Perhaps if our own minds became more sensitive, they could show that the subject and object are really one, so that we could see that there is a totality in which both I and non-I are going on in an essential relationship and interpenetration of being. Then one might understand the similar problem in physics in a new way. So I think meter comes into its own in this respect by pointing out how we can get this merging of I and non-I in a very sort of more easy to handle way. Okay, so on to meter. So, I mean, we should expect maybe some dual aspects of meter, given that meter is providing the musical time, basically. So as Victor Zuckerkandl puts it here, music is the temporal art par excellence. Now, we might compare here to Hans Primus's work on time and tense from the point of view of dual aspect thinking. He has a paper called Time Entanglement Between Mind and Matter, where he goes into these things. And he notes that time comes in tensed and tenseless dual pairs corresponding to the subject side and the objective descriptions. And then the idea is that neither description can be reduced to the other. They're supposed to be complementary in some kind of Bohrian sense, but both are necessary to complete the picture. And so, for example, on the objective side, we have tenseless concepts that are things, philosophers would call them B-series events, earlier than, simultaneous with, later than. And then on the subjective side, we would have tensed concepts that are generated by relating events to the present. So they say that there's some special moments in there. Now, we can certainly say the same about the meter of a piece of music. The idea is that from the inside point of view, there are certain beats and pulses that are given special significance that from the objective point of view do not have any particular special significance. So there's an inner way of viewing meter and an outer way of viewing meter. Another way of framing this mind-world tension is in terms of whether meter is a cause or effect of the accents in the music. So classically, we would say something like the accents are what is generating meter in music. A more modern approach would say that the metrical hierarchy itself is what generates accents. As Templey puts it here, a metrical structure consists of a framework of rows of beats where beats are points in time. So that would correspond to the inner picture, and they're not necessarily events. The meter of a piece must be inferred from the events, which is going to be the outer structure of the piece, of the meter. In this sense, a metrical structure is best regarded as something in the mind of the listener rather than being present in the music in any direct way. That I disagree with. So given this, this kind of view of meter, it almost functions like a kind of space-time metric. So this is made particularly clear by this quote of Kalinsky. So he refers to meter as a background against which rhythm and the audible rhythmic surface are defined and perceived. So this kind of links to an absolute Newtonian space, the way he expresses it here. Okay, so that's a sort of regular uniform mesh that gives lengths and durations and velocities and locations and so on. But there seems to be a disanalogy in the case of meter, actually, because there's a strange bootstrapping in this case, in which the very rhythmic surface is initially defined by the background. So it's a bit more like general relativity, I think, where we have a situation where space tells matter how to move and matter tells space how to bend. So in this case, I think we've got something like pulse tells meter how to accent, and meter tells pulse how to beat time, something like that. I need to think that through a little bit more. So we have something like a dynamical model of meter. As Justin London puts it here, embracing a dynamic model of meter is not without theoretical cost. If meter is still part of the music, it's no longer phenomenally part of the musical sounds and structures in the same way as pitch, timbre, dynamics, articulation, and duration. And well, I think that's absolutely true. And the same can be said for tonality as well. So better to say that meter is sitting under both the phenomenology of music, whether objectively construed or subjectively construed. So we have something instead, I think, like this, which is we have a classic duality between these objective aspects, which are the pulses, the subjective aspects, which are the accents, the beats, and they're really coming out from this sort of, well, call it an absolute or the psychophysically neutral realm, which is providing the monistic basis for both of these two aspects. And the reason why we see correlations between the outer and the inner in this case is because we've split this monistic entity in the way that Harald mentioned. So we're naturally going to get correlations. So you need two aspects to manifest a universe like this. Now, something that needs further thought, as I said, this is work in progress where I'm still trying to think of the best way of expressing the relationship between between the two sides. But because meter has to do with time, we can sort of make sense of the fact that the musical experience is emerging by looking at the timeless nature of this unus mundus, as Jung calls it. So he writes here, the unconscious has no time. There's no trouble about time in the unconscious. Part of our psyche is not in time and not in space. They are only an illusion, time and space. And so in a certain part of our psyche, time does not exist at all. And the background of our empirical world thus appears to be an unus mundus. So I think this possibly links, I think, to the numinous nature of music and musical experiences. We might even think of meter as being a key part of a synchronicity that's sort of generating these very meaningful experiences that people seem to have when they're having musical experiences. There's something a little bit special about musical experiences. You can indeed have exceptional experiences in music. So I did have a few more slides, but I think I'll leave it there because it is very late here. Share and out.
Hello?
Okay.
Can you hear me,
Hello.
Dean?
Yeah.
Dean, thank you so much for this excellent, beautiful illustration of the dry stuff that I presented before you. I think this was fantastic. Thank you so much. I mean, even if the hour is pretty strange to you, but I know you are a hard worker, so you probably didn't go to sleep before you started talking, right?
I did, and I'm actually organizing another conference in 6 hours.
But that's in Australia.
Yeah.
So you can be there in person.
Exactly.
Good. So thank you again. And now we have the talk open for questions. Yes, would you please come to the microphone?
Thank you for your talk. I just wanted to ask you a simple question. You quoted somebody who rings a bell. He explained that the experience of the now means something special for man. Who was that author?
So that was from Carnap, from a volume for Einstein. And the quote was to do with Einstein was writing a letter to his friend Michelle Besso's widow. Besso had just died and she was mourning, and he was saying, it's the quote where he says, look, physicists like us know that the past present and future, that how did he put it? The past is just as stubbornly persistent in future. The distinction between the past, present, and future is a stubbornly persistent
So
illusion.
it's in what book?
It's edited by Schlipp, and it's Einstein, Philosopher Scientist, Open Court Press.
Okay, say the title again. Einstein's
Philosopher Scientist.
Yeah,
philosopher.
Yeah, Albert Einstein / philosopher scientist.
Okay.
That's a collection of different pieces about Einstein's theory. Also contains Einstein's autobiographical notes.
Mhm.
And
Yeah,
he also
exactly.
responds to all the commentators at the end of the volume. It's a whole series of volumes about important philosophers. Yes.
And
But-
the author again is
Well, but so the point I was going to make was, but this was Rudolf Carnap talking about Einstein.
Okay.
And then he
All
points out that Einstein still had this insistence that there was something special about the now for man,
Okay.
regardless of that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Dwight. There's another question, please.
Hello. I was interested in the description of time, music as a temporal art. And it reminded me of Alan Watts' observation that trying to divide time up into individual instants was mistaken because, for example, you can't describe a wave by just taking an instantaneous measurement. So I think it relates to music, and I just wanted to ask if you had thought about that or if you have any observations about that.
Well, I suppose only going back to this idea that I briefly mentioned at the beginning, which is that you are, because it's an experience and we're sort of having the experience now, it all has to fit in this threshold, this window of awareness that we have, which is only quite a short window, a few milliseconds to a few seconds. So in a sense, music is defined by this window of awareness. It doesn't make sense to have music that exceeds this window of awareness. And the notion of music happening at a point or something like that is, of course, completely nonsensical. So it needs temporal development and the themes, for example. So the whole business of the approach that I mentioned of those two linguists, Lardell and Jakendorf, they base it on this thing called Schenkerian analysis, Heinrich Schenker, who analyzed pieces of music as extremely long developments of themes, which you wouldn't ordinarily pick up on. So in order to make sense of those, you absolutely need to think of time as being something very, very extended and non-point-like. Music doesn't make sense without it.
Thank you.
The point that was just discussed reminds me to something like a complementarity between duration and frequency, right? So the sharper you want to define the duration of a tone, the more unsharp the frequency gets, and the other way around. So there's a kind of complementarity which can even be expressed mathematically. So, but the interesting point is that when you look at a piece of music written down in musical notation, you have duration and frequency in one and the same system expressed as if they could be expressed with the same amount of accuracy together. And I was always wondering, is that what's behind that? Is it just an ingenious invention to represent music that way, or is it doing some fake with the complementarity of duration and frequency?
Oh, I don't know. I honestly don't know. I would need to think about that one.
Or is it even? I mean, the basic question is, the first question is that even an interesting question, or does it completely miss the point?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think we'd need to discuss this.
Okay.
I think.
Good. Are there further questions, Paavo? Yeah.
Yes. So thanks very much. Now I think this may be something that you already touched upon your talk, but I'll ask anyway. So it was interesting way you emphasized the more like the preconceptual aspects of music, and perhaps there were views represented that reason cannot understand music, but of course then there is this tradition going back to Plato, Pythagoras, where we think of music in terms of numerical ratios, and there's the idea of harmony of the spheres, and that in a way might suggest that perhaps music has something to do with the essence of reality, and that is actually something we can grasp rationally in terms of ratios. So I'm just curious of whether you have, in your study, whether you have come up with this and how you relate that to the idea of music as more preconceptual, something that we cannot understand rationally.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the Pythagorean ideas might be just a different way of making sense of the absolute nature of music. I think that's it's kind of a different representation of the nature of the absoluteness. In terms of the sort of preconceptual nature of music, there was something I was going to discuss but didn't, which was these new experiments that have been done, especially on meter, that show that it's called neural resonance theory. And you can show that there are groups of neurons that become entrained with the music in specific ways, so that you can see the results in an electroencephalogram. And it follows the subject side version of the meter. But the point is, you can cue somebody to switch the meter that they decide to put on one and the same input stream. So Harald has some stuff on bistable perception, where you have things like the duck rabbit and you switch between them, or the Necker cube. And a very similar thing can happen with the case of meter perception. So it looks like there's something much deeper going on, way beneath the level of perceptual awareness, and yet meter is clearly guiding our perception of music in a very key way. And you can even find, for example, that vocal mimics like parrots and so on are able to entrain because they have this same set of neurons, but clearly they don't have any conceptual understanding of music. So there's clearly something going on at a very conceptual level when it comes to meter, especially.
Okay, Paavo is satisfied with this answer. Great. So I don't see any more questions right now. So I suggest we let you rest now, Dean.
Yeah.
We have to go to the next meeting. And at Tucson, we are now going into the break. It's now 10:20, close to 10:20. And I think we should reconvene at 10:50, so half an hour break. And I'm looking forward to welcome you again in 30 minutes. Thanks again, Dean.
Thanks, Harold. Thank you.
Ja, genau.
Ich bin Harald mit E.
Harald.
Harry.
There were a few more questions there if you want to tackle them. Sometimes the letter
This is the
M
same
words.
stuff here.
Yeah, okay. So you can also, if you want, you can dismiss them by pressing that one.
Yeah.
Three dots and then choose dismiss, or else you. Okay. You don't mind. Yeah, sure. We'll hide this. Drop it down. Okay. No, that's fine. So, yeah, you're muted there. Okay. Yeah, once you get our, that's right.
No, so happy to meet you.
The past would be
If I go to the toilet,
Yeah.
they come in with all
Yeah.
these set questions.
Don't worry
I
about it.
never get ready with them because once you answer questions,
Okay, I'll be back.
they generate immediately.
Don't
They
get nervous.
generate.
I'm
Yeah.
down.
Yeah, calm down.
Yeah, I'm trying.
I'm trying to hold it.
Okay.
So you know, Miles
And
is a doctor
Oh, okay.
and
Harold,
he is
are
an
we
organist and everything.
It's not ready yet.
So this is the perfect talk for him to come into, but he just made.
I'll be back.
Interesting, so.
But I'm sacrificed anyway from school.
Okay.
Was it about the disruptor that
No, basically
you are conducted here locally or no?
No, no.
Rome,
Europe.
yeah. Rome and Manila,
No.
Bangor,
Everybody says
but anyway, you made that statement about the interest
Yeah, great. Okay, I think we probably should get started. And so roughly, I'm thinking the timeline, so we gotta. Oh yeah, okay, great. And so I might, let's see, I might just go a little bit over that. Very good. Okay, so welcome back to the to this workshop, and I'm Paavo Pylkkänen from Helsinki and also University of Skövde in Sweden. And of course, I've been coming to these conferences since '94, not every time, but many times. So of course, these some of you I know already, but anyway, here we go. And just about this topic of Bohm's dual aspect monism. So Bohm is my kind of long-term interest, and actually some of these ideas were those that got me interested in these questions, like the mind-body question. Reading some of the Bohm's materials, this was back in the 1980s. So in a way, this is also going back to some of those my early interests. And but anyway, so the start from philosophy of mind, and one could say that a key question there is, how does the mental affect the physical and vice versa? But of course, okay, we can ask a question like that. One could even say, well, does it affect the physical? I mean, is the question already presupposing something there? But there are further questions like, what is the mental? Is it different from the physical, and different in what sense? Like a property or even a separate substance? We might also ask, does the mental really affect the physical qua mental, as mental, as opposed to through its physical correlates? And then we could also ask, or you see, as you can say, or do the physical correlates of any given mental states do the causal work in the physical domain? So that's these are the kind of typical worries in philosophy of mind. And there is, as far as I can tell, there is this debate, the discussion has been going on for a long time, but there's no commonly accepted satisfactory answer to these questions. You see, of course, we could just say that the mental is part of the physical, like the mind-brain identity theory. In this case, there would be no special problem of mental causation, but we would still have, like, physical causation. What is the nature of causation in the physical domain? Which is, of course, another big topic in metaphysics and philosophy of science. But I won't go into that now. Now, at the same time, we could say that, you see, many philosophers of mind are unwilling to say that the mental is just physical, nothing but the physical. But of course, then we need to say what it means for the mental to influence the physical and vice versa, or else we end up with epiphenomenalism, which is the doctrine that mentals, it could be that, usually said that the physical gives rise to mental properties, but the mental properties do no causal work, they're inefficacious. And this doesn't feel satisfactory because at least intuitively, it feels that our mental states guide our actions. Now, so the prevailing framework in philosophy of mind is physicalism. Of course, we might, discuss how strong this is, but still, it's at least still a fairly strong prevailing, at least one of the dominant ones at any rate. But there's also something known as non-reductive physicalism, which says that there are these mental properties which cannot be reduced to physical ones. So they are
non-physical properties. Mental is non-physical. But it's typically added that these mental properties, they're not just free, floating free, but they are depend or supervene on physical properties, which is usually defined by saying that there cannot be a change in the mental without a change in the physical. So there's a sense in which the physical is primary, stronger than the mental. Okay. But again, you see the key problem for this non-reductive physicalism is mental causation. If mental properties are non-physical, how could they possibly influence the physical? An important principle is the causal closure of the physical domain, which states that if a physical event has a cause, this can be completely described in physical terms. There's no need or room for non-physical properties to do any causal work in the physical domain. And also, our physical actions are not caused by our mental or non-physical states, which is epiphenomenal and which feels very unsatisfactory. Now, so what I'll talk about here, the general theme is dual aspect theories as an alternative to physicalism. The way Harald Atmanspacher characterizes this briefly is to say dual aspect monism is a metaphysical framework addressing the mental and the physical as two aspects of an underlying reality that is neither mental nor physical, that is psychophysically neutral. Now, what I'm asking is whether dual aspect theories could account for mental causation in the sense that I've discussed just before. I'll be considering David Bohm's notion of soma significance, which is kind of connected also to his view of the implicate order. One should say that, you know, the way Harald was describing, he was emphasizing actually not so much causal influences between mind and matter, but something that they arise and the correlations can be mediated by meaning. So it's not the usual kind of influence. And in fact, David Bohm, especially in the implicate order framework, I think he was proposing something that fits quite well with what Harald was saying, where he thinks of the mental and physical as some sort of correlated projection from a multidimensional reality, where there's no direct mental to physical causation, if you like. But I think Bohm also had another more causal pull or desire to describe things. Of course, he's well known in being the first to propose a consistent causal interpretation for quantum mechanics. He wrote a book about causality, a book called Causality and Chance in Modern Physics. And I do feel that there was some element left there also when he was thinking about the mental and the physical. That there might, you know, we might also need to account for the way the mental influences the physical. And this is something that I personally have kind of, and I'm myself also attracted to trying to solve this in some sense, maybe a more traditional, perhaps even a more old-fashioned problem, at least whether we can say more about it than current physicists can do. So, but well, let's see. So this goes back to, paper was published in 1985. It's called Soma Significance and the Activity of Meaning. And this is actually a paper I used to know Bohm in the early 80s and even, you know, until he died in 92. And I actually got this paper as a preprint. I was still pretty young at the time, the start of my studies, but I found the paper extremely kind of exciting. And in some sense, I felt that it did capture something very essential about the mind and body and our existence. And I still kind of feel that. I sometimes, you know, ask my philosophy colleagues or postdocs to read the paper and say what they think about it, and some of them do find it quite difficult or not very clearly defined or whatnot. So that's why, in some sense, this is still a work in progress for me, trying to actually go back to some of these ideas and see whether they're consistent, and whether there are problems with it, but also whether there actually is this sort of genuine value that I felt from the very beginning there. So what is this sum and significance? Well, it's a new notion of meaning. And of course, that makes it interesting for this workshop and Harald's discussion, where he was emphasizing meaning in the context of dual aspect theories. Now, when Bohm offers this new notion of meaning, sum and significance, it's also meant to provide a new notion of the relationship between the physical and the mental. So he wants to approach the, if you like, the mind-body problem. And so, and it's partly a linguistic of Bohm, like playing with words, neology. He was very interested in, of course, language, the way words kind of shape our thinking and maybe also provide opportunities, but also create problems for us. So the term soma significance, and there's a reverse term signosomatic, is offered as an alternative to the term psychosomatic, because one way of thinking, maybe, I don't know if this would be a common sense way of thinking of psychosomatic, but it might imply interaction between two separate entities, whereas soma significance does not. And this could, of course, at least so naively, we might think, well, the word psyche comes from a Greek word meaning mind or soul, kind of an entity. And soma means the body. And if we generalize soma to mean the physical, then the term psychosomatic would suggest two different kinds of entities, each existent in itself, but both in mutual interaction. So this would be a kind of substance dualism, which has its well-known problems. And there again, Bohm, he would feel that this would introduce a split between the physical and the mental that doesn't properly correspond to the actual state of affairs, where there is no such split, he would claim. So there we go with the new term soma significance, which emphasize the unity of the mental and the physical, or soma and significance, actually unity of soma and significance, and more generally, soma and meaning in all its implications and aspects. The idea being that, significance goes on to a meaning which is a more general word. And in this Bohm approach, meaning is being given a key role in the whole of existence. We actually did a conference with Bohm together back in 1986. And the title of the conference was Meaning as a Key Factor of Being. So we got it rhyming. And not defining meaning here, but just saying in the broad sense, it would include significance in the say, what does this sentence mean or signify? It could be also intention in the sense, I didn't mean to do that, but also value in the sense, this thing means a lot to me. And so Bohm would claim that this what we find in the English language with the term meaning is no coincidence, but it's actually revealing the different important aspects of meaning, which can also influence each other. Something that has very broad significance can be sensed as valuable. Some people find the Bible very valuable. It's a huge amount of words. It could be, but at the same time, our values may give a rise to our intentions, and so on and so forth. But I won't spend much time on that here. The idea here is that as we got here to the dual aspect theory, so the notion of soma significance, it's meant to imply that soma, or the physical, and its significance, which is the mental, are not in any sense separately existent, but they would be two aspects of one overall reality. Now, what is an aspect? the way what Bohm would say that it means like a view or a way of looking. He would say it's a form in which the whole of reality appears, displays or unfolds, either in our perception or in our thinking. It adds saying that each aspect reflects and implies the other, so that the other shows in it. And of course, we can describe this aspect using different words like mental and physical, but still the idea is that they are revealing the unknown whole of reality from two different sides. So, but this is sort of important in the way that you could say that what is our own, as human beings are, we have, you know, access to our body. I mean, you know, a body appears to us, but then we also have our thoughts and, you know, especially when we are dreaming, then we would have displaying a more like some representation of mental reality. Now, Bohm, of course, liked to use analogies, and one analogy to illustrate unbroken wholeness that are, you know, we have unbroken wholeness, but then it makes sense to distinguish aspects in it. He thought the usual thing here would be to compare the relationship of electrical poles or charges and magnetic poles. Sorry, electrical poles or charges and magnetic poles. Because with electrical charges, we can think of them as separately existent and connected by a field, but this is not so for magnetic poles, where we could say that they're really one unbroken magnetic field. And if we would take a magnet with a north and a south pole, we may consider that there is a field going around the magnet from the north to the south pole. And this is, of course, you've seen that with iron filings in such a way. But you see, if you take this magnet and break it, you get two magnets, each of which has a north and a south pole, like this. And there's actually no separate magnetic pole, because even when the magnet is not broken, we could see every part of it as a superposition of north and south poles. And there's a kind of flowing relationship in that sense. It's everywhere in that. So this is just an analogy or illustration, but but anyway, the concept of opposing pairs of magnetic poles, it would help us to express and understand the basic relationship in the overall magnetic field. I think Hegel, you know, at the time of Hegel, people are quite excited about this notion of using the notion of poles in this way. And so Bohm proposes that we look at soma significance in a similar way. These things, soma and significance, there are two aspects distinguished only in thought. And if we do that, this would help us to express and understand relationships in the field of reality as a whole. So just as the notions of the magnetic poles is useful, so it's also useful to distinguish these soma and significance. Now, how are these things related? Well, the idea is that each particular kind of significance is based on some somatic order, arrangements, connection, and organization of distinguishable elements. That is structure. So there's a kind of at least a kind of supervenience here, where we think of the significance supervening on the underlying somatic order. And of course, the simple example would be even here, these letters that are visible on the screen, they would carry a meaning, and that meaning can be somatically carried further by light waves to your eye and processed by your brain until you will, if you understand the language, you will then apprehend the meaning of what is being said, right? Kind of, this is sort of an obvious, right? And there's another distinction, more aspects to be added, because as this process, like in this case, the process of perception would take place, the meanings along with their somatic concomitants become more subtle. Where this is another term Bohm liked very much. And the subtle is just something, you know, various finely woven, but it could have these meanings such as highly refined and so on. And this contrasts with the manifest, which means literally what can be held in the hand. So the idea is here is that reality has actually two further key aspects, the subtle and the manifest, which are closely related to sum and significance. This might even be so that even in physics, you might say that in classical physics, where we're dealing, the objects are more manifest, whether it's, you know, of course, particles are manifest, but it even feels like the electromagnetic field are in a sense manifest. Whereas when you go into quantum mechanics, you will still have physical processes, but they would be more subtle and not equally manifest. Anyway, but that just perhaps to connect that also to physics. But so how does this work? Well, each somatic form, such as a printed page, would have a significance, and the claim is that this significance is more subtle than the form. And also such a significance can be held in yet another somatic form. So for example, when I'm reading a book or reading this text, then the meaning will be carried by various activities in the brain. And this is a more subtle physical process than just the printed page, or the, you know, the forms there. One thing to realize here is that this distinction between subtle and manifest is relative, because what is manifest on one level may be subtle on another. The idea here being that suppose that in my brain there is some meaning that is carried by the relatively subtle somatic form of thought, where exactly that would be in the brain, and you know, these are of course difficult issues in neuroscience. But suppose that we for the sake of the argument just assume that there would be some kind of your thought has a physical, is carried by a physical somatic form. This could then be grasped in still higher and more subtle somatic processes. So what Bohm is saying that if you are doing, for example, metacognition, then the meta level has to be physically more subtle than the target level, which is being apprehended. And this would then lead on further to grasp of vast totality of meanings in a flash of insight, connecting also what Harald was saying before about the meaning not being not just information, but things like understanding and insight. So Bohm has this, of course, very strongly here. Anyway, and this can be even, he would say that if this kind of thing where a more subtle level is required to grasp a certain level of meaning, then you could call this apprehension of the meaning of meanings, which can go on indefinitely deep and subtle levels of significance. Okay. And so there can be this kind of changes. The role, whether something is manifest or subtle, will depend on whether there is a higher level, which is like more subtle, making this level manifest. Okay. And this is again a bit like the magnetic poles. And the idea here is that you wouldn't have, in any experience, you can't have all the content purely somatic or purely significant, but there'll always be the two poles, and that's the suggestion here. Okay. Now, this is what we talked so far is what we can call the significance of soma, meaning each somatic configuration has a meaning, and it is such meaning that is grasped at more subtle levels of soma, which Bohm calls the soma significant relation. Now, actually, I think it's a bit too strong to say that each somatic configuration has a meaning. I think Bohm should there have said it has at least potentially a meaning, because you know it could be the case that it doesn't have meaning for anything. But anyway, I think he qualified this in some later work. but basically the idea is that each somatic configuration has a meaning, at least potentially, if not actually. Okay, but now of course the interesting thing for mental causation, which I mentioned in the beginning, is the inverse signosomatic relation, which is the other side of the same process, in which every meaning at the given level is seen actively to affect the soma at the more manifest level. And this is, of course, relevant to understanding how mental causation works in the Bohm approach. And the favorite example is this, that, you know, suppose a person sees a shadow in a dark night. And if it happens because the person's past experience, that this means an assailant, the adrenaline, you know, there'll be the adrenaline will flow. You will get this kind of what Bohm calls a signosomatic reaction with all the powerful physiological effects. However, if it means only a shadow, the response of the soma is very different. So you know, you are not reacting. And so the more general claim is that the total physical response of the human being is profoundly affected by what physical forms mean to him. And he would say that the change of meaning can totally change your response. And then the meaning is contextual. It will vary according to all sorts of things, such as, you know, your ability, background, conditioning, and so on. Okay. Now, and this again is the idea that this is different from psychosomatic, because insofar as you think of psychosomatic as interaction between two separate entities, the claim here is that there is only one flow, and a change of meaning is a change in that flow. So this is like, if we think about ourselves, so we, you know, in a kind of our existence or our being. So we you know, this is kind of Heraclitan, a process view of ourselves. Okay. And so he could say any change of meaning is a change of soma, and any change of soma is a change of meaning. So there is not this distinction. I mean, this sounds all in philosophical terms, this would already sound as a two-way supervenience, because in philosophy of mind, supervenience usually means there cannot be a change in the mental without there being a change in the physical. But of course, the way Bohm puts it, he seems to be saying that there cannot be a change in the physical without the change of meaning. That is maybe a bit too strong in the sense that later on, Bohm defines saying that information is a difference of form that makes a difference of content, which allows there might be differences of form that make no difference of content. So actually, I wouldn't put it this strong, but anyway, the idea being still that in many cases, the change of soma would be a change of meaning. This is again like, you know, this article it's fairly general, like a big brush, and one has to be, you know, look at the details in some cases. But still, I think the basic idea is still pretty interesting. And again, if we think of this mental causation, the signosomatic, so you see, as a given meaning is carried into the somatic side, it would continue to develop the original significance. So going back to the example where if something means danger, then there'll be not only adrenaline, but a whole range of chemical substances would travel through the blood. And of course, even in science, people use terms like that these would be like messengers, carriers of meaning from the brain to various parts of the body, and instructing the various parts of the body to act in certain ways. Of course, this is one notion of information, is which, for example, Floridi would mention, is information can be like instructional. And there are other, you know, information, there are also other kinds of like semantic and so on and so forth. And of course, we know that in the brain, we have these so-called signals, which function in a similar way, and this way, the original significance, for example, danger, would unfold in such a way to instruct the body. So this would be our signosomatic process. And this can sort of go on to more manifest levels until there's a physical action, physical movement of the body. And that's of course another very important, because we do have action theory is very important in philosophy, and people are still struggling to have a meaningful, good account of how our mental states influence our actions. And I think Bohm is here, trying to do that for us. Now, he would say that there is this two-way movement of energy, where each level of significance would act on the next more manifestly somatic level, and then in perception we carry the meaning of the action back in the other direction. So this would be the cycle, the action perception cycle, which of course people like Piaget, but also even in cognitive neuroscience, people are rather interested in. Again, I think what Bohm does is to give a bit more a philosophical framework for this thing, whereas quite often people implicitly just accept the dualism there, and therefore these theories are not very philosophically coherent. And I'm not saying, Bohm can really necessarily solve this, but at least he's giving attention to this side of things. And this is just to illustrate the way this two-way process, where you can see on top would be the perception, which is like the soma significant, where the significance is carried to the more subtle levels. And once the meaning is apprehended, then they'll kick back to the other direction. And this is, of course, going in us all the time. The two directions are taking place. Okay. And so he would say things like that. Nothing would exist in this process except as a two-way movement, a flow of energy, where meaning is carried inward and outward between the aspect of soma and significance and this, subtle and manifest level. And he would claim that it's this overall structure of meaning that is grasped in every experience. So, understanding meaning of things is not just like passively doing like this refers to that, but there's also involves this, on the one hand, the soma significant process, and at the same time this signosomatic, which is kind of what's sort of going on in our lives. This is proposal. And so, and again, well, this is another example, just which we already discussed, the way like in perception, when we perceive things, then the information is being carried to more subtle levels, and then in the other direction, these higher meanings are signosomical. They connect to reflexes and so on and so forth. Okay. And so the big picture would be that that even relationship with nature and with the cosmos would flow out of what they mean to us, and so they would affect our actions towards nature, and thus indirectly the action of nature back on us is affected. So in this framework, we human beings mean something to nature. And so nature will respond accordingly. This is again, ecologically a very important notion, because maybe in our mechanistic picture, we just think, we are human beings are here, we exploit the world and nature, and the universe doesn't care, it's just a machine, okay? Whereas here we think that in this signosomatic process, actually nature would reply. And so so in this case, the whole of nature, including our civilization, which has evolved from nature and is still part of nature, is one movement that is both soma significant and signosomatic. So it's not only in our own body, but this would extend in this is the way, it's a way of looking at the world which we would have. Okay. And anyway, so I'll skip here something. Should I stop fairly soon in terms of time? Okay, maybe I just go a little bit longer. So because I seem to have a bit more than just this. Anyway, so some this could be just reflexes or instincts, but they can be even more complex. And one example is the behavior of bees. You know, bees, the honeybees, you know, that when they're very hungry, when they don't have food or nutrition, and then one honeybee finds somewhere food, it can actually have this dance where it indicates the direction and distance of sources of nectar. So one would say, okay, they might not be conscious of it, but there is a meaning going on. So this would be an example of some sort of communication still. And of course, then with higher animals, this is more evident, and it's also then possible to develop conscious awareness, and meaning is then more central and vital. I mean, this is a consciousness conference, but we're not, here saying much about exactly how we develop consciousness. That would be the hard problem. There'll be other topics, and tomorrow there'll be a concurrent session. Maybe it will be solved over there, but here it just mentioned. Okay, now let's go back to mental causation, and I'll try to finish fairly quickly. So remember, this non-reductive physicalism has difficulties of giving an account of how mental properties as mental influence physical properties. And how would this work in the Bohm's dual aspect framework? Well, we've seen there's no strict and absolute distinction between the mental and the physical. You will not find in the universe something that is purely physical, meaning it has no mental aspect, or purely mental, meaning that it has no physical aspect. Well, you could ask, is this really plausible? Are there material objects that are purely physical? And we could see what some contemporary metaphysicians say about this. I've been just teaching a course in metaphysics, so that's why I got someone. So, for example, the philosopher Alice Sannay, considering this issue, would then come up with suggestion that material objects are those that are located in space and time, though they might not have extension in space or duration in time, and they have mass. Where Jessica Wilson would add that these scientific criteria should be supplemented with the metaphysical one, meaning no fundamental mentality requirement. If something is a material object, it doesn't have any fundamental mental features. If it has any mental features, these features are explained in more fundamental physical terms. And well, they would add that anyway, whatever we say, this would be partly an empirical matter and something we may revise as our physical theories change. And I would actually suggest that the way Bohm and Hiley have looked at quantum mechanics does actually suggest a new kind of view here. But let's see how these requirements work in the Bohmian framework. So there's again this thing about material object, and we might say, well, surely an electron is a material object, if anything is. Now, what does quantum mechanics say? Well, you see, in the usual Copenhagen interpretation, it's not meaningful to say that an electron is a particle located in space and time when it's not observed. It's only when you make a measurement that you can say that. But there is also the de Broglie-Bohm interpretation, de Broglie in the 1920s, Bohm 52, that we can make a meaningful hypothesis about the electron as a little particle guided by a new type of quantum field. And when Bohm and Hiley further developed this, they call this the ontological interpretation. This field is not an ordinary material entity. They would actually suggest that this quantum field contains active information and can be seen as a primitive mind-like property or aspect of the electron. So we find these aspects even at that level. And this is just for some of you, it's the picture that we have this particle guided by field. You could just have one of them, but I couldn't find a better picture or draw myself. But anyway, so this is just a way of thinking about, in classical physics, you should just get two piles on the plate, but in quantum mechanics, you actually get many. But this is explained in the Bohm picture through this. So go quantum potential, and you get those trajectories. But I'll just mention that the key point being, if you look at the equation of quantum potential, it only depends on the form of this quantum wave. not on the amplitude, and that's how information comes into it. And so, now if you think about the Jessica Wilson saying that the material object mustn't have mental features, then we could ask, well, is the active information of the electron a mental feature that cannot be explained in more fundamental physical terms? And here you see Bowman-Hiley would say that you see the wave, it's the wave function that carries, if you like, the active information. And this information content in the wave function is quite generally in a non-manifest implicate order, while the particles live in the ordinary explicate order. And so again, they would, in this model, they would say that this is connects to this sum of significance, that they would say that the movements of the particles then express the meaning of the information content in a manifest explicate order. So this would be like a signosomatic process where you know, when the particles are actually guided by a kind of meaning or something analogous to meaning. And you could ask, well, but is that meaning purely mental? And they actually do consider that this would be carried by some energy, even in the case of the quantum field. They admit, I mean, Basil Hiley, as Harald mentioned, he's working on this. And who knows, maybe he will tell us what is the origin of quantum potential one of these days. But at this earlier stage, Bowman-Hiley just say that, you know, we don't know what is carrying the information at quantum level, but they do assume that there would be some kind of you could have some structure at the more finer levels. That but anyway, so what's the relation of this to this Wilson's idea of, you know, no fundamental mentality? We could say that active information at the quantum level is fundamentally mental in a certain sense, because its content cannot be reduced to a material process. Because in a way you can see that as a postulate that Bohm is sort of postulating that there is this content as an aspect that you don't reduce. But again, it's not purely mental because it also has this physical material aspect, although we don't, you know, this is currently unknown and maybe very subtle. But so you don't just find pure content, not even at the quantum level, but you would have this. And so finally, we're getting there. We could ask, well, how does mental causation work in Bohm's dual aspect monism? And we've seen that meanings at subtle mental levels act signosomatically toward more manifest physical levels. The physical is not purely physical. Even an electron has a mental aspect which is causally efficacious. And so we cannot understand what happens in the physical domain in purely physical terms. And so therefore, this causal closure of the physical doesn't quite hold in this picture. We're kind of giving that up. But there is nothing purely mental either. If you take even a very subtle mental state, you would always find a material or physical aspect. And so, so this is the way, here we go. So to conclude, it seems there is a two-way traffic between the mental and the physical in this picture. It's not an interaction between separate entities. It's a relationship between levels where each level has a mental and a physical aspect. And information actually here would act as a bridge between the more subtle and the more manifest. And I think I'll end there. Thanks very much. Thanks. I've been with over time.
Very much. I think this is just the last few slides. They illustrate in a very nice way that meaning, active information, has to be a relational entity. Because whenever you say it's not really only material, but also mental, and then it's not only mental, but also material, then this expresses nothing else than the relational character that always is inherent in meaning. Right. Meaning is a kind of relational currency, if you want, which connects the two. Right. Very nice. So we have time for maybe one or two questions, if there are any. So this is Godehab Brintrup from the University in Munich.
Just a quick question. Have you ever compared your view to the Whiteheadian picture? Because it looks very similar, and I think it would be a very good ally for your position. Process and reality, or science in the modern world.
Yes, thank you. It's also, I think when Bohm was developing his ideas, these kinds of ideas already maybe late 50s and early 60s, he was reading Whitehead, and because in the correspondence with Charles Biederman asked, so what is there something you could read, or, you know, so then Bohm said, well, it's pretty much nobody's doing this kind of thing, but, you know, Whitehead is somewhat similar. There was also a conference where Bohm, Prigogine, and Whiteheadians talked about physics and the ultimate significance of time, which has been published and edited by Griffin. So there's some discussion, and actually Bohm himself discussed this a little bit. This is more the implicate order when you have like this unformed explication in relation to Whitehead's notion of concrescence and those. So there has been some discussion there, but anyway.
Well, it's good that you mentioned Whitehead, because many people, even some expert philosophers, would say that Whitehead is difficult to digest, to say the least. Partly because he makes up all these notions which nobody else really uses. And so one of the interesting questions would be whether a kind of vocabulary between Whitehead and Bohm might clarify issues on both sides. So that might be an interesting project for the future, right?
Yeah.
So other questions? Yes, please.
I might have missed this, but your definition of mental, you mentioned the bees, yes, and the interaction, but for example, bees don't make choices really, they respond. I'm just wondering to what level your definition of mental includes freedom of choice or experiential, levels of experience. You might have gone over that, but I'm just wondering how you define mental.
Right. So, well, it's of course a good question. I think philosophers would bring in things like intentionality, some representations that have intentional content and other kinds of things. Of course, the question is there that to what extent the behavior is just mechanical reflexes. I think what the idea here is that even reflexes could be seen as having a sort of primitive mental aspect insofar as there's some sort of significance involved. But I think the example with the honeybees is still that this is not a completely mechanical response. I remember actually once in a meeting with Donald, was it Donald Griffin now? Yes, I think so, yes. And people were debating there that whether the honeybees, they're just like, stupid machines, completely mechanical, just pre-programmed. And what he said, that's what you would think if you don't really observe them. But for his entire life, he had actually observed, for example, the honeybee, many situations. And and he was actually, we even talked a little bit about consciousness there, and I think he was quite happy, to entertain the possibility that the honeybee might be conscious. There are, of course, others like Werner Backhaus who have studied the color vision in honeybees and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to say, but this kind of dance it's definitely an interesting phenomenon. I mean, I guess one could look at more carefully how people have studied it and interpreted it recently, but the idea there is that it's an exceptional behavior in extreme conditions. And of course, usually when we think about the function of consciousness, even in humans, when we need consciousness is when something unexpected happens. So who knows? whether there's some level of a little bit of consciousness going on with the honeybee. I don't know.
I may add that there will be a plenary session one of the next days on the topic of even plants being sentient. So you can drive this to the extreme, as you will see.
Right.
Now I think it's time to thank Paavo now, because we are going on to the next speaker now. Paavo, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Chris, can you put Robert Prentner on? There he is. Good morning, Robert.
Hi.
Hi,
Good
from
evening.
Munich. Robert is at the Munich Center for Mathematical Philosophy, and he will be the final speaker in this session. Again, we will end the session at 12:30, so we have another 50 minutes overall. And Robert, you will tell us how much discussion we can have at the end.
Well,
Good morning.
I guess we will see. I should just start. I thank you all very much, especially the organizers, for putting together this workshop. I must say I'm very excited about dual aspect monism, because I think it's maybe the most interesting conceptual framework which is currently around to understand mind-matter correlations. And more specifically to the topic of my talk, I'm interested in this so-called neural correlates of consciousness, so correlations between brain activity and consciousness. Okay, so what's the plan for today? I will briefly start with a kind of introduction. I will present the so-called what I call the received image, which is the, I would say, scientific, philosophical community mainstream view about this mind matter, specifically about this brain consciousness correlates. I will illustrate that with two examples from more modern research. Then I will make a little digression into phenomenology. It's a philosophical subfield, which I will, mostly continental tradition, which I will introduce. You might think it's a bit of a digression, but I think it kind of fits very nicely here. In the very first talk, Harald talked about Schelling, and that he has a kind of dissenting view on Schelling. Schelling is often portrayed as an idealist, and he thinks there's certain dual aspect things in Schelling. I think a very similar thing is true actually for phenomenology. I will talk about that. Some common, in my opinion, misunderstandings about phenomenology. And then I will come to the final part of my talk, which is about dual aspect monism again, and about a new kind of conceptual framework for understanding this neural correlates of consciousness. Okay, but first things first. So how do people standardly think about mind-matter correlations? And here you see on that slide, there's already a problem of presentation, which I had. And the problem is this. Try to find a picture which kind of clarifies that you want to talk about the mind without actually showing the brain. It's very difficult, and it kind of illustrates the way how most people actually think about the mind. So what's the standard view? Standard view is that experiences are something like representations or perceptions. Not everyone is a representationalist, but I think what I will say now fits to most people in the field. So experience is a kind of representation of some external, usually material or physical world. The brain has a very special function. It encodes such representations or perceptions. And some of these representations are additionally conscious rather than unconscious. And the theory in the science of consciousness is mainly about spelling out under what conditions is a representation conscious or not conscious. And the empirical consequence, if you want to study that in a lab, would be to look for the so-called neural correlates of such conscious experiences. Now, in a bit more detail, what are the neural correlates of consciousness? There's an influential definition by Dave Chalmers, who wrote that an NCC is a minimal neural system N, such that there is a mapping from states of N to states of consciousness, where a given state of N is sufficient under condition C for the corresponding state of consciousness. It's a kind of, I think it's a very clever, actually, definition. There are 2 points which I want to emphasize in that definition. First, the definition of an NCC is really about a minimal neural system N. So it's not enough to say the brain as a whole is a kind of correlate to consciousness, or the body as a whole. It's really about trying to pin down minimal neural systems. And if you, again, look on the empirical side, if you read empirical research, that actually creates a lot of problems. It's really difficult to pin down the exact minimal system. Many people in the field, in the scientific study of consciousness, they believe that's really, really difficult. There are precursor processes to consciousness, like attention, and there are consequences of consciousness, whether you can report what you're conscious of, or whether consciousness is kind of written and coded in memory. And there's a lot of debate what's the real, so to say, proper NCC. The second property which I want to highlight in Chalmers' definition is this idea that neural correlates or states of neural systems are sufficient but not necessary for consciousness. A lot of people in neuroscience, they talk as if there was this necessity claim, but actually there is not this necessity claim. What I mean by this is the following: if you have a certain brain state, then if it's sufficient, then you can say, okay, there is this conscious experience which is associated to it. But you cannot say that you would not have the conscious experience if you wouldn't have this brain state. So a particular or any conscious experience can be multiply realized. There can be a brain state. There can also be another brain state for the same conscious experience. There can even be, like in plants, maybe there can be some information processing state which is correlated to consciousness, which is non-neural in nature. Okay, how might this be put to work? Really currently in the lab, there's one example of research which is currently done. So the idea would be to regard consciousness and the brain as two kinds of representations. It's a mathematically sophisticated way to put it as two kinds of categories, and to study how the structures of the brain and the structures of consciousness relate to each other. What you would do, you would conduct certain psychophysical experiments, then you would measure the brain response to it, and out of these responses, people try to extract certain mathematical quantities. Here on the slide, it's called the MICS. That doesn't really matter what it means. And this structural, so to say, story about the brain is compared to a structural story which you would tell about consciousness, usually based on subjective reports or on other measures, and then you try to compare it. And if you're lucky, you would find that there's this kind of systematic connection between the structure of the brain and the structure of consciousness. Okay. A second item which is traditionally encountered with this kind of neural study of consciousness is the question, what is a self? There's a quote by the philosopher Galen Strawson. I won't read the full quote here. It just means to illustrate that there are many, many, many notions of the self which are around today in the literature. What is a self? There are more than 20 different kinds of selves which people thought about. if you want to, or one can give maybe a very rough classification in terms of 3 types of theories of the self, what I call an entity theory. So the idea is that the self is a single persistent mental thing. So a very intuitive notion, a dualistic intuitive notion of the self that we have, a continuity theory or a pattern theory, where the self is understood as a kind of continuous process, psychological process. So for example, those people who believe that the self is something like a story that the brain tells itself would probably endorse such a continuity theory. And the third broad class of theories about the self is what I call a bundle theory, and that goes back to the philosopher David Hume. And he kind of famously wrote that he wanted to introspect his inner experiences and find out what this self actually is. And he was, to his disappointment, he kind of only reached, or he only saw that there are different kinds of perceptions or feelings, pains or whatever, but no such thing as a self. So he concluded, or one can conclude from this, that there actually really is no such thing as a self. There's just a bundle of conscious experiences, and maybe the self is the name for the bundle, or the name for the glue that holds the bundle together, or for the intersection. That would be a bundle-like theory of the self. And one more recent example of this is the self-model theory from Thomas Metzinger. It has 2 important steps, and that theory actually relates very closely to dual aspect monism. And the first step is what Thomas Metzinger calls a phenomenal self model. So the self is not an entity or a representation of an entity. The self is just a model, and the contents of the model are all the ongoing processes which are happening inside the body, or processes between the body and an environment. But the model is such that the system that has that model, so the brain, is not aware of it being a model. In the second step, which is the very interesting step for dual aspect monism, Thomas Metzinger talks about the relation between the self model and another model which is instantiated in the brain, which is a model of objects. And he talks about the model of that relation. So it's something like a kind of second order relation on top of these self models and object models. And that's what he calls a phenomenal model of the intentionality relation. So intentionality is a relation between subjective and objective aspects of a model, which you can in turn also regard as a model, or you can use a model to represent that. And that's what Thomas Metzinger thinks is actually happening when we would want to scientifically study first personal perspectival experience. Now, both examples which I told you about, there are some things which I like about these examples, and there are some things which I do not like about these examples. So if we go back to the first example, which was the category theory example of brain function, what I actually like about that example is this idea that we can talk about what the brain is doing, what our minds are doing in terms of structures, in terms of relations, maybe in terms of categories. I really like that. What I don't like about the model is most people, not all people, but many people think about this relation between structures. They think about that as a kind of identity, an isomorphism in math speak, so to say. And I think that's a very strong relation, and it's probably not what we will find, but which would be the natural thing to expect if we are physicalists. So if we believe that it's just some physical entity, a physical stuff which is going on in our brain, then we would expect to find an isomorphism here. But I think that's very unrealistic to actually find an isomorphism. So it's much more, the probability is much higher to find something like a many-to-many correlate. Now, the second thing, even if people are skeptical about isomorphisms, and some people are actually, then they might find a different relation, factorial relation in category theory. But still, the problem is here, the relation is brute. So we have a relation, we are lucky, we can even state it in a very systematic way, but we have no idea where it comes from. And I find that actually very unsatisfactory. And I believe the dual aspect monism opens up certain approaches towards that question. Okay, I'm coming to the second example again, Thomas Metzinger's theory of subjectivity. So I like the idea that you think about models of models, that you make models of relations. I think that's a kind of cool idea. What I'm a bit skeptical about in that particular example is this idea that intentionality is kind of exhausted by this notion of a relation between a subjective and an objective pole. I believe intentionality has much more to it than just this reference relation. And I will talk about this in a later part of my talk. But first, before I do that, I will kind of finish this first section with an outlook on very recent work in the neuroscientific study of consciousness. So there was a study which was just published, I think 1 or 2 months ago in Nature Human Behavior. And one of the co-authors is actually here at this meeting, Lucia Meloni. She will give a talk on Friday on a plenary. She probably knows much more than I about this research. But anyway, so what they did in that paper, they compared a couple of leading theories in the neuroscience of consciousness, namely global neural workspace theory, integrated information theory, and recurrent processing theory, and also higher order thought theory to some extent. And several interesting findings came up in that study. One finding is, if you look at all the fMRI studies, which supposedly support those theories, and if you bring them together, then you will find that the whole brain, not just some specific area of the brain, but really the whole brain is kind of implicated in consciousness. So that's kind of puzzling finding. So there's no convergence on any particular mechanism or any particular location. It seems that everything matters to some extent. And the second finding, which I found very interesting, which I really found striking actually, they trained a computer program, an algorithm, to predict whether an experiment will or will not support any specific theory. That's of course very easy if you know the experimental outcome. So if you know the experiment will predict this and that, then it's very easy to say, oh, that's consistent with that particular theory. But they actually trained it. They trained a predictor that could, to 80%, make the correct guess just based on the methodological setting of the experiment. So you really don't need to look at the experiment, you just need to look at the experimental choices of the people who did the experiment in order to be able to predict which theory of consciousness will be supported by that experiment. So I found that very striking. And there were various interpretations one can give to these or similar findings. My favorite interpretation, so to say, is this, that you have these different theories of consciousness, and they're probably able to enlighten you with respect to certain aspects of the problem. But what's really missing is something like an overall integrative framework of these different theories. And I think dual aspect monism, and specifically a certain kind of dual aspect monism, is promising to give you such a integrative overall framework. Okay, with that, I'm coming to the second part of my talk. I will briefly talk about phenomenology, philosophical phenomenology. I already mentioned it. phenomenology can be traced back to the German philosopher Edmund Husserl at the turn to the 20th century. There are many different schools of phenomenology and different ways of defining what phenomenologists are actually trying to do. One way the way I like best is to define phenomenology as the study of the invariant structures of our experience. And Husserl's particular approach is very mathematically inspired or mathematically sounding. It's not very surprising. Husserl was trained as a mathematician. He was actually a very accomplished mathematician, and chances are very high that that influenced on a very, at least in a very subtle way, his later philosophical writing. Now, phenomenology is rich with one of the concepts, maybe the central heard about this idea that intentionality has something to do with a reference relation or representation between subjective and objective aspects, what phenomenologists call the directedness. But there's more to intentionality than just that. There are also ways of being directed, ways how this reference relation changes over time, how it's modified, how it's constituted. Oh, sorry. I got apparently I got kicked out for whatever reason. Very sorry for that. Trying to open my slides again. Okay. Oops.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Well, could you?
We didn't get the last 2 or 3 minutes of your talk.
Oh, okay. Well, okay. Now you should see my screen again. Oops.
You should get back to the slide on Husserl, and you were just off during the last point, the dynamical understanding of intentional content.
I see. Okay, so intentionality, it's one of the, or it's maybe the central concept of phenomenology. And I just said that there are various aspects to intentionality. And the first aspect is this Brentano-Metzinger idea of a reference relation or of a representation of aboutness, of being directed towards a certain object. But there's more to intentionality than that. There's also this idea that there are certain different kind of ways how this directedness unfolds, how it reference is constituted, and in a more non-phenomenological language, one would say what Husserl or what phenomenologies seems to be advocating is a dynamical understanding of intentional content or of intentionality. And I was just briefly mentioning this pair, noesis-noema, which is a technical notion in phenomenology, but that's not so important here. Okay, so now I probably the most important part about phenomenology is about the typical misunderstandings of phenomenology. So the first misunderstanding is that phenomenology is just a version of psychology. It's maybe a kind of philosophical precursor to cognitive science. I have here two quotes by Husserl himself. First one is in German. I apologize for that. I didn't find the English one. Husserl said, es ist von vornherein scharf zu betonen, dass die reine Phänomenologie nicht Psychologie ist. Sie ist schon als Ideenwissenschaft so wenig Psychologie, wie die Geometrie Naturwissenschaft ist. So what Husserl seems to be advocating is an analogia proportionalis. So phenomenology relates to psychology in the same way that mathematics relates to physics. It's the formal study of possible ways how things can play out. So it's not really interested with the concrete empirical implementations. And the second quote in this context, and I think that quote is particularly interesting for the topic of dual aspect monism. It is precisely the apparently so obvious thought that everything given is either physical or mental that must be abandoned. So Husserl believed that phenomenology, the thing that phenomenology is actually studying, is more fundamental than the individual psychological makeup. Okay, the second misunderstanding, and now that's a very typical situation, I think, for phenomenology, because there are many, as I said, there are many kind of sometimes strange sounding concepts, and there's a lot of interpretive activity, how it's actually meant and how one should think about these things, and that happens all the time in phenomenology. One thing pertains to the notion of a self. I briefly introduced the self-model theory of Thomas Metzinger, for example, which relates to that point. So phenomenologists sometimes sound as if they were assuming an explicit self as basic constituent of reality. So a self is either kind of a thing that populates reality, or our notion of self is somehow a representation of a thing that populates reality. And that's probably not what phenomenologists actually meant. There's this quote by Thomas Metzinger: no such things as selves exist in the world. Nobody ever was or had a self, which is kind of fitting. And of course, Thomas Metzinger is not a phenomenologist, but that's a very strong opinion against something like an entity view of self. But phenomenologists, although they might sound as if they were endorsing such a theory, are actually not endorsing such a theory. And then one can try to guess, well, what do they actually mean when they talk about selves? And one idea is called the pre-reflective notion of self, or what I call a pre-reflective mode of subjectivity. Selves are nothing but universal objects within these bundles of experiences. A slightly more technical hypothesis, which I would bring forward at this point, is to say that self has something to do with a category theoretic notion of a co-limit, which is a generic universal object in category theory. That might be a very interesting entry point to look at the more formal definition of a self. So I'm not advocating that we should go to the phenomenological literature, study it deeply, and come up with a kind of super interpretation that is able to circumvent all the dilemmata and which is able to circumvent all these kind of problems that come up with it. What I advocate is actually to try to get a more formal model of what phenomenologists may be meant, and try to actually make sense of this way in a very precise way. And earlier I speculated about a particular model that could do that. I called it the model of phenomenal spaces. So the idea would be to find a representation that reflects certain important phenomenological concepts. I wrote a paper about unity and a little bit about embodiment. I won't go into the details now for time reasons. But the idea is that phenomenology can be reconceived as the study of how such representations, so how such phenomenal spaces relate to each other. On the one hand, that's kind of nice. That might give you a good handle on a good, say, a good mathematical interpretation of phenomenology. But on the other hand, it creates a big problem, or there is this big question. Well, if it's true, then there's still this open question how phenomenal spaces are constituted in the first place. And I think here, dual aspect monism might be a good, or might be an interesting conceptual framework to understand how phenomenal spaces are actually constituted. And the answer would be, well, we have to understand this process, how these processes, according to which meaning unfolds, to understand how these phenomenal spaces are constituted. And which brings me back to the initial topic of my talk, which was understanding the mind-matter correlation, the NCC, in terms of dual aspect monism. And the answer would be, well, instead of just thinking about this brute correlation between matter and mind, understand it, how it's kind of rooted or grounded in a third entity, in a tertium quid, which I called Q on this slide. And the hypothesis would be that the dynamics of intentionality, so what phenomenologists are actually trying to describe, is guided or is the same, is isomorphic to the evolution of this tertium quid, or this third entity. So to summarize, a disappointing feature of the correlational project, so the standard view of thinking about neural correlates of consciousness, is that the relations that people come up with, or hope they come up with, the relation would actually be brute. And there's no understanding of this relation. And we actually want to understand, or I want to understand that relation, and I just don't want to give you a table or give you a formula of these correlations. I really want to understand the reasons why they exist in the first place. And the first way forward would actually be to find a common framework that would allow us to make inferences from one domain to the other. So we know something about one side of this domain, and then we can make inferences to the next side, or maybe even more interesting, we have an hypothesis about this evolution of Q, and from this hypothesis, maybe there are some certain that can be compared to certain observations which we would have about the correlation or about the individual correlata. So that slide can be kind of understood as a brief summary of the talk. Our subjective experience is correlated to objective processes in the brain. So that's the basic premise of the neural correlate of consciousness business. And I think there's a lot of evidence now that actually these correlations exist, but we just don't know what they mean. Second thing is the whole brain seems to be implicated here. You remember the slide which I showed you with the brain and the pictures. There is no single neurocomputational mechanism that is responsible. Responsible is a way of how other people phrase the issue. But the question is, how are the different neurocomputational mechanisms orchestrated? And the hypothesis would be to say, well, the orchestration is due to this unfolding of meaning. So graphically, you have this NCC, you have this neural correlates of consciousness. You have dual aspect monism, which is the kind of conceptual framework that would explain the presence of these correlates. One variety of dual aspect monism, which I find very interesting, is this idea that the underlying reality has something to do with meaning. Now, here's the point where phenomenology might become relevant. Phenomenology can be understood as a way, or as a proposal that kind of describes various dimensions of the evolution of meaning. And secondly, I want to emphasize again that phenomenology might sound idealistic, So might encounter some things like constitution in subjective experience when you read phenomenology texts, but actually, I think phenomenology should be understood as referring to something outside subjective and objective terminology. Okay, I would have some brief examples, but I will go very quickly over that. One is an ADS-CFT correspondence-like phenomenon. I got inspired to that example actually by reading the book of Harald and Dean. ADS-CFT correspondence is a technical, I won't go into the details, but a technical way of, within string theory, to relate different kinds of theories. And I think a very similar thing could be done if we think about the mind-matter relation, or the relation between brain and consciousness. There exists a common symmetry which relates different ways of representing related aspects to each other. Second example, people probably know about this one, heard many examples about this one, quantum or quantum-like structures, which might be how I call the pullback metaphors. Interesting for the problem of understanding mind-matter correlations. Here you see a picture actually of Erwin Schrödinger. So I'm from Austria, and when before the euro was in Austria, we had these nice shilling bills, and the 1,000 shilling bill featured a picture of Erwin Schrödinger. Of course, almost no one knew who he was, but still I like it, and I feel a bit nostalgic when I see it. Where there are various known analogies between quantum mechanics and mind-matter systems, or mind more generally, non-local properties. So we heard a lot about quantum entanglement, and really the analogy to mind-matter correlates. You have this field of quantum cognition, to think about quantum-like structures in our cognitive processing. One metaphor which I like very much, but which I don't know too much about, but which I think one should look at, is relation, or the potential relation between transcendental phenomenology and collapse. Transcendental phenomenology just means we're not after a description of the manifest structure of subjective experience, but we're after a description of the conditions of possibility to have this manifest structures of experience. And there might be very interesting relation to what some people refer to as collapse phenomena in quantum mechanics. And the very last example is a very general example. We had this nice talk by Dean Rickles, who talked a lot about musical experience, about the theory of the meter. I think that can be generalized to art more generally. The idea that art is neither a subjective nor an objective process, but it's something like a it's about the mediation between this subject and object pole to get to a new understanding of reality. With that, I thank you very much. I thank everyone for fighting the hunger and staying with me. Thanks.
Thanks, Robert. I don't know whether you see this, but here in the audience, your talk generated a lot of applause.
Oh, that's good. No, I didn't see, unfortunately.
Good. We have a little time for questions. If you want to ask a question, please come to the front, to the microphone. And before that will happen, I have one for you.
Yes.
You said that it's one of your slides, you said that the dynamics of the intentionality relation depends on the evolution of, what you call the Q, right? Now, I think a consistent thread in many of the dual aspect approaches is that in that Q, there is no time.
Yes.
Q is timeless. So what does evolution of Q mean when you don't have time?
Yes, that's a very good question, actually.
I think so, yes.
I must say, I don't know. I just use this metaphor. Maybe evolution is then the wrong word to use in that context.
In other words, how can one think about process without applying a notion of temporal evolution? Or is that possible? I know that people like Whitehead or others, or even David Bohm also talks about process. You know, when you hear this notion of hollow movement, this implies a kind of process, although then he says in the next sentence, this must not be misunderstood as an evolution of a state as a function of time.
Yes, I know a lot of people are actually talking about that, and there are a lot of people say, oh, we mean process, but we don't mean change in time in some sense. Well, and then the question, of course, is how else do you mean? How else would you kind of specify that? Of course, there's always this possibility that you have a certain parameter, and then you look at changes according to that parameter. But it seems to be kind of weaseling out and just use different kind of notions.
It's true, because you don't know how to specify that parameter, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think, but I don't know how he constructed Carlo Rovelli in his theory. I think he mentioned somewhere that he has a very similar problem, but he also had a solution to that problem. But I don't remember the details of how it worked. But it might actually be an interesting.
Rovelli and Alarcon, they have the theory of thermal time.
Mm-hmm.
And thermal time is an emergent property. And when you map the emergence kind of feature to dual aspect monism, then the emergence of time would exactly happen at the transition from Q to the physical domain.
I see.
So still within Q, you don't have that kind of time.
Okay.
At least not that kind of time. We don't know which one.
Yeah, I cannot really answer your question then, actually. I think it's actually a very good question, but a difficult question.
Yeah, it seems difficult. If even you don't have an answer.
No, it must be difficult.
Another point which I wanted to add for the audience here also is that a physicist philosopher in France, in Paris, Michel Bibbol, actually tries to work on a kind of phenomenology that exactly matches what you proposed in your, was it the second example at the end? Kind of phenomenology approach, which has no
exactly,
no objective. So if you want to see some contemporary work on this idea, then check Michel Bitbol's work, Bitbol.
Okay, thank you. Well, I know his work, but I don't understand it, unfortunately. But maybe I have to reread and digest more. It's actually often the case with phenomenology.
Yeah. So it seems that everybody is hungry now for lunch, because here in Tucson it's now lunchtime right now. Paavo, do you have a question? Okay.
It's one question that came in the chat from Mark Pizzato, and that is, how does the self, in your theory, relate not just to NCC in brain, but also the body and relations beyond it with other people and things? Is the self separate from them or interactive, as in 4E theory of consciousness, namely embedded, embodied, inactive, and extended?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So my first pass at answering that question would be, well, what you call the interactive aspect, the 4E aspect, the embedded, embodied, inactive, and extended aspect, already should flow into the basic constituents of an NCC, of part of what I call the orchestration between different computational processes in the NCC. So I would relate it even a bit earlier than, I would also give it it's a bit more prior to the question in itself. how I would conceive of the self is to a relation of certain spaces which are already influenced by this 4E thinking.
Very good, thanks. I could finally just say that you may be aware that Stephen French, the who does the structural realism, he is also very interested in this question of connecting phenomenology and maybe even like the collapse. And we actually, it so happens we have I'm part of one of the supervisors of a PhD student in Helsinki, Ilpo Hirvonen, who is working on Husserl, and I think he's now, they just recently got a grant to study with also this connection of phenomenology and quantum mechanics, and his supervisor is Mirja Hartimo, who is also a Husserl scholar. So we might have some interesting, hopefully, interactions in the future, because I think there were many common interests. I could also comment that the kind of quantum phenomenology is, I think Bohm was trying to do that also in the implicate order framework, like when he was trying to characterize our experience of listening to music in terms of the implicate order. But I'm just mentioning this, there are many, I like the talk, it was very rich, there were many interesting ideas, and I'm sure we can explore these things in the future, and maybe in the framework of dual aspect monism. But then I'll hand it over to Harald so you can.
Thank you very much.
So we have one final question on the floor.
Very brief, very brief.
Very brief, okay.
Primitive too. What is lost when, in addressing the question, what is the self, when one attempts to answer that from third-person perspective, which makes sense, rather than from a first-person perspective? In other words, is there something that's understood from the first-person perspective that doesn't get translated from the third-person perspective? I'm thinking of that essay long ago of Nagel, What is it like to be a bat?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you need to be in it in order to really understand what it is?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think there are two. There's one trivial answer, of course. It's always a different whether you are a system or whether you just have a description of being a system. So I think there's just a very trivial difference here, but there's a more substantial difference that relates very much to this work, to the work of Thomas Nagel, actually. And I guess most people would say that what's lost in this transition from a first personal description to a description from the first person is exactly this first person perspective which you would have. So the idea that it really it's actually hard to describe to use different words to describe them than first person perspective, actually. So this aspect of actually being directed at certain intentional content, I don't see how everything about that can be captured in a purely third personal objective description. Yeah, I think that's what's lost in translation, so to say.
He cannot hear you when you're not on the microphone.
Oh, sorry, I was too far away from my screen.
I was talking to the person who asked you, right? Not to you, Robert.
Just that phrase. What's lost is what did you say?
What's lost is the first personal perspective on actually being such a system.
Yes.
And I think that's just what is lost by definition. What people would say is lost in the difference between first personal perspective, first personal descriptions versus first personal description.
In other words, would be what?
Or the actual quality of being that system.
I see. Okay.
Okay, good. Thanks for the questions in the whole morning session. And Robert, thank you very much again once more.
Thank you.
Right. And thank you in the audience for staying with us right to the end. We will have lunch now. And then I wish you much fun in the afternoon workshops, which begin at, I think, 2 o'clock. We don't know. I think 2 o'clock, yes. So, thanks. Goodbye.